Even if the opifices of Ardea are to be understood as slaves, the united body of plebeians and opifices acting in opposition to the optimates comes nearer to Brutus' description of the situation at Rome under the Tarquins than does anything that can be found in our historians' pictures of Rome in the 5th century. The Origin of Tyranny by P. N. Percy Neville Ure. Chapter Roman 8. Rome. All the historical labors bestowed on the early centuries of Rome will, in general, be wasted. Sir George Cornewall Lewis, On the Credibility of Early Roman History 1855, Vol. Roman II, p. 556. At the time of the birth of Herodotus, which took place about the year 484 before Christ, Polycrates, Pisistratus and Croesus had been dead less than 50 years. In Corinth and Sicyon it was not more than a century since the tyranny had been suppressed. The historian had probably met people who remembered the tyrants of Samos and Athens. He may possibly have talked with old men from the cities of the Isthmus whose fathers had told them personal experiences under Cleisthenes or Periander. The case with the Tarquins, the tyrant kings of Rome, is very different. There is nothing even approximating to contemporary literary evidence for their history, or even for their existence. In recent times their whole claim to be regarded as historical has been disputed. It may therefore seem something like begging the question to proceed at once to collect evidence for the narrative before clearing the ground by discussing its authenticity. There are, however, two reasons for following that course. The first is that the question of authenticity can be more easily discussed after the narrative has been called to mind. The other is that the value of the story for this inquiry does not altogether depend on the Tarquins' historicity. According to the extant narratives, King Tarquinius Priscus was the son of a Corinthian named Demaratus, who had settled in the Etruscan city of Tarquinii, the modern Corneto, some 50 miles north of Rome. The fullest of these narratives, that of Dionysius, makes Demaratus sail to Italy intending to trade, in a private merchant vessel, and with a cargo of his own, having disposed of his cargo in the cities of the Etruscans, and acquired great gains. He continued to ply the same sea, conveying Greek cargoes to the Etruscans and bringing Etruscan goods to Greece, and became the possessor of very great wealth. He quitted Corinth and set up a house in Tarquinii, which was then a great and prosperous city. All this property was left by Demaratus to his son Lucumo, the future Lucius Tarquinius, who, receiving his father's great wealth, resolved to engage in politics and take a part in public life, and to be one of the foremost men of his city. He is described as migrating to Rome for the specific reason that there seemed more prospect there of his wealth leading to high political power, and as finding there the opportunity he was looking for. At Rome, says Livy, his wealth brought him into prominence. So Dionysius, he very soon became friends with the king Ancus Martius, making him presents and supplying him with funds for his military requirements. He also secured many of the patricians by his benevolences, and won the favor of the common people by his courteous greetings and the charm of his discourse, and by contributions of money. Similarly Aurelius Victor, by his money and his industry he secured high position. So too Diodorus, speaking of Tarquin's rise to prominence in Rome, being very wealthy, he helped many of the poor by giving them money. Still more specifically, our oldest authority, Polybius, says Lucius, the son of Demaratus the Corinthian, set out for Rome trusting in himself and his money. These passages are enough to show that according to all our best extant authorities, and therefore presumably according to some earlier common source, Tarquinius Priscus owed his throne to his previous wealth. The writers just quoted apparently pictured Tarquin as a royal favorite who used his great wealth and ability to pave the way in the palace for his own succession, or possibly as merely a wealthy demagogue, but there are indications in the accounts that have come down to us that Tarquin's power may have had a somewhat different basis. When Demaratus was making his fortune in Etruria, he was probably, if the story has any historical foundation, a great employer of labor. Strabo speaks of the large number of skilled workmen who accompanied him from Corinth. Pliny speaks of the Corinthian as accompanied by the potters Victors Eucher and Eugramus. As Tarquin is made by both Livy and Dionysius to succeed to all his father's possessions, the received accounts may be taken as implying that he too was master of a large number of skilled workmen. This is the intention of our narrative, is borne out by Dionysius' account of the migration of Lucumo, as the subsequent Tarquinius was then called, from Tarquinii to Rome. He resolved to migrate thither, collecting up all his money, and taking all who were willing of his friends and relations, and there were many eager to go with him. On his arrival at Rome, the king assigned him and the Etruscans, who had come with him, to a tribe and curia. This whole description implies that Lucumo's fellow emigrants were free men. Nothing is said as to their occupations. On the other hand, the narratives of his father's migration to Tarquinii make no statement as to whether the skilled workmen who accompanied him were free men or slaves. But the temptation to equate the two bodies is considerable. Later on, when on the throne, the Tarquins are represented as employing free skilled labor on a large scale. The object alleged by Livy for the first Tarquin's numerous public works was that the people might be as much employed at home as they had been in the army. The Roman army did not include slaves. About the Tarquins as large employers of free labor we shall find more precise and significant statements when the story of Superbus comes to be discussed. But in the accounts of Priscus there is one further statement that associates him closely with the trade of Rome. The same king, says Livy, speaking of Priscus, apportioned sites round the forum for private individuals to build on, and erected arcades and shops. So Dionysius, he adorned the forum by surrounding it with workshops and arcades. It is surely somewhat remarkable that King Tarquin should be thus associated with the building of shops. Between the first and the last of the Tarquins, our accounts are unanimous in inserting Servius Tullius. Livy and Dionysius make him the son-in-law of Priscus. Servius, who is thus assigned to both the period and the family of the Tarquins, is stated by several authors to have been the first to issue coins at Rome. Varro, for instance, informs us that they say that silver coinage was first struck flatum by Servius Tullius. So Pliny, King Servius, was the first to stamp signet bronze, and again Cassiodorus, King Servius, is said to have been the first to strike a coinage impressus monetam in bronze. These statements cannot be accepted just as they stand. Silver coins were first struck in Rome in 268 before Christ, and the first round copper coins, the large E's graw with a Janus head on one side and a ship's prow on the other, are now unanimously assigned to the middle of the 4th century. There is, however, nothing to preclude the possibility of important monetary innovations or reforms by a 6th century king of Rome. Copper has been found in central Italy in various forms that point to a copper currency prior to the introduction of the round E's graw. There are the rough pieces known as E's rude, the objects of various simple shapes but entirely devoid of decoration known as E's formatum, and the pieces rectangular in shape and marked with a type known as E's signatum. Though the extant examples of E's signatum are plainly on stylistic grounds to be assigned to long after the regal period, and though the objects discovered along with finds of E's rude do not point to a very early date, it would be rash to say that either E's rude or E's signatum, or for that matter E's formatum, was not as early in origin as the 6th century. Willers dates the use of E's rude from 1000 before Christ to the 4th century, and supposes some developments during the period, one of which, e.g., the couchinfimic bun-shaped variety of E's formatum, or the bars with various patterns, may possibly be due to Servius. If Servius is to be associated with E's formatum, the bun-shaped pieces have perhaps not quite so good a claim as those to which Heberlin gives the name tortenfimig, something like the flat round weights with a flange that are made to fit into one another, since these latter appear from the full data that Heberlin has collected to be characteristic of S. Etruria. They have been found mainly at Caere Tarquinii and Castelnuovo di Porto between Rome and Phalaris, i.e. in great part at places with which Rome had particularly close connections. But neither the couchinfimig nor the tortenfimig E's formatum suits the literary evidence so well as Willer's bars with various patterns. These appear to constitute the most primitive form of E's signatum. Pliny's precise account of Servius' innovation is that he introduced E's signatum in place of the earlier E's rude. Pliny indeed goes on to say that Servius money signatum est nota pecutum. Among extant pieces, this description is applicable only to certain fully developed examples of the quadrilateral E's signatum that, as remarked already, have to be assigned to a later date, but whereas Pliny's statement about Servius and E's signatum is based on Timaeus Sicily, 3rd century before Christ, it is quite uncertain whether the remark about nota pecutum is to be referred to the same respectable authority. Pliny's own words are, Ceruius rex primus signet E's. Antia rudi usos rami Timaeus tredit. Signatum est nota pecutum. Assume a historical basis for the accounts of Servius' connection with the Roman currency, and the motive for his activity in this direction is not far to seek. Just about the period to which his reign is dated, Greek coins began to penetrate Etruria, They belong mainly to Phaeacia and the Phaeacian colonies. Now in the days of King Tarquinius, so Justin tells us, Phaeacians from Asia put in at the mouth of the Tiber and formed a friendship with the Romans. The Phaeacian coinage may well have led to some reform or regulation of the home currency, though the statement of Aurelius Victor that he Servius established weights and measures may perhaps come nearer to the truth than the more detailed assertions about striking a coinage that have been already quoted. Even if this was all that Servius did, it is enough to make him stand out as a commercially minded statesman, since he is represented as the first ruler in Rome to regulate units of exchange. The chief positive objection to a 6th century date for even the most primitive form of metallic currency is the fact that down to the time of the Roman 12 tables 450 before Christ all fines were paid in cows and sheep. But evidence of this sort may be given too much weight. As pointed out by Ridgway, even in a great commercial Greek city like Syracuse, the cow formed the basis of assessment in the reign of Dionysius 405,367 before Christ. Syracuse had minted masterpieces of silver coinage some time before Dionysius was born. Enough has been said to indicate the possible significance of the accounts of King Servius and his copper coins. Too little is known about either the king himself or the 6th century currency to build much upon their reputed connection. The matter is not one of first importance for our inquiry. There can be no question of a revolution in the currency, such as there are reasons for attributing to Gyges, Phaedon, Pisistratus, and probably others of the early Greek tyrants. Reforms or innovations in the currency are quite in keeping with the other activities ascribed to Servius. The step most commonly associated with his name is the institution of a census, ex quo belli passus communia non iuritum. At Antioch, sed pro habitu pecuniarum ferent. Another institution that has been attributed to Servius is that of the collegia opificum or unions of workmen. The early history of these collegia is obscure. Plutarch attributes the 8 earliest of them carpenters, potters, tanners, leather workers, dyers, coppersmiths, goldsmiths, flute players to Numa. The two versions may both have a historic basis if we suppose that the collegia as private corporations go back into the early regal period, and that later they passed under state control. This view is of course incapable of proof. The evidence limits us to conjecture. But one point seems fairly certain. The collegia must have lost importance when slave labor came to be much used. Servius is constantly accused of having secured the support of the poor by gifts and benevolences, and special mention is made of his distributions of corn and land to the plebs. In short, King Servius, if he be regarded as a historical personage, appears to have inherited the policy as well as the position of his predecessor. And his violent accession and no less violent end to have been due mainly to feuds within the palace. The same conclusion is the most natural one to draw from his Etruscan name of Mastarna, quite apart from the etymological value of Garthausen's suggestion that the name Mastarna is a prefixed form of Tarquin. Servius was eventually overthrown by Tarquinius Superbus, who is said to have secured the throne by buying up the poorest of the common people. It is in the account of his reign that we find the fullest statements as to the Tarquins' relations to labor while they were kings of Rome. Nothing could be more explicit than Livy's statement on that point. He summoned smiths from every part of Etruria, and employed upon it on the building of the temple of Jove on the Tarpeian Mount, not only public funds, but also workmen from among the plebeians. The statement that Tarquin's employees were largely plebeians and not slaves is repeated by Livy later in the same book. In this second passage Brutus, declaiming against the state of things that had existed under the Tarquins, is made to declare that men of Rome had been changed from soldiers into artisans and quarrymen. Dionysius is as explicit and more detailed. He was not content to offend against the plebeians merely in this way. He enrolled all the plebeians who were loyal to him and suitable for military requirements, and the rest he compelled to find employment on the public works in the city. Thinking it a very great danger for monarchs when the worst and poorest of the citizens are unemployed, at the same time he was anxious during his reign to complete the works left half finished by his grandfather, channels to drain away the water, and the Hippodrome amphitheatre. On these works all the poor were employed, receiving from him a moderate provision. Some quarrying, some hewing wood, some leading the wagons that conveyed this material, others bearing the burdens on their own shoulders, others again digging out the underground cellars and molding the vaults in them and erecting the corridors. Subordinated to the artisans thus engaged, there were coppersmiths and carpenters and stonemasons, who were removed from their private shops and kept employed on the public requirements. So in the same book, Tarquin, after this achievement, gave the people a rest from expeditions and wars, and occupied himself with the building of the temples. He set all the artisans to work on the undertakings, and a little later Brutus is made to tell the Romans that Tarquin compels them like bought slaves to toil at quarrying and wood-cutting and carrying burdens. It is nowhere explicitly stated that it was to this control of the free labor of the city that the Tarquins owed their power. On the contrary, according to Livy, the populares helped to turn Superbus out for the very reason that he had forced them into this Banausic life. They were indignant that they had been kept by the king so long employed as smiths and doing the work of slaves. This by itself would certainly suggest that the Tarquins had used their kingly power to turn the free men of Rome into artisans and quarrymen, and not their army of employees to turn a capitalist into a king. But the smiths summoned from Etruria, who are associated with the Roman plebeians, recall the large number of skilled workmen mentioned by Strabo as working for Demaratus at Tarquinii, and suggest that we have here a continuation of the activities that had made the fortune of the Tarquin family while still in Etruria. There is a further statement in the same chapter of Livy that certainly harmonizes better with this latter alternative. At the time when the plebeians suddenly discovered the degrading nature of their occupations, not apparently without the help of the abler members of the nobility, Livy informs us that the king had run out of money, exhausted by the magnificence of his public works, Similarly, Dionysius makes Brutus urge on his fellow conspirators that now is the time to carry out their plot. When the armed citizens are no longer controlled by Tarquins presents as formerly. That Tarquin's regime was one of sweat and wages, but never of blood and iron, is borne out by Cicero, who observes that we never hear of Tarquins putting Roman citizens to death. Later writers speak of Superbus as employing penal labor and various forms of torture and intimidation on a large scale. But these statements, which have plainly a common origin, are no less plainly embroideries upon the aristocratic misrepresentations of the Tarquins' labor policy. The truth is expressed by Florus in Senatum Caedibus, in omnis superbia qui crudelitate groyer est bonis brassetis. In other words, Superbus was a harsh and unpopular employer. This personal unpopularity must have contributed, along with the exhaustion of the royal treasury, to reconcile the common people to the republican regime, which for them was certainly the beginning of an era of oppression and misery, since they had lost in the king their natural protector. If the Tarquins' power was really commercial in origin, and if the account of it in writers of the age of Livy is in the main outline historical, then the facts ought to be found influencing the history of the early republic, and in particular the measures taken by the aristocrats to prevent the restoration of the monarchy. What is in fact the sort of situation represented as most alarming them from this point of view? The first indication of the direction of their fears is to be found in the account of Collatinus' banishment, recorded by Livy as having taken place in the first year of the Republic. According to Livy, it was simply the hated name of Tarquin that led to his banishment. Collatinus was reluctant to withdraw. He only did so from fear that later, when no longer consul, the same fate might overtake him with the loss of his property into the bargain cum bonorum omission. Livy does not always work over his material sufficiently to make it quite harmonize with his own interpretation of it. It looks as though it was the bona, the wealth of Collatinus, that led to his expulsion. Though plainly not the strongest influence in Rome at the time, it may have been sufficiently strong to be a perpetual menace to the aristocratic government. It is the Primors Ciuitatis who insist on his withdrawal. If in Dionysius on another occasion Collatinus is made to argue that it was not the tyrant's money that had been harming the city, but their persons, the protestation only shows that there were others who did not share this view, but thought rather, with Dionysius Marcus Valerius, that there was a danger lest the people, beguiled by the tyrant's benevolences, should help to restore Tarquin to the throne. The same view is implied in a speech put by Dionysius into the mouth of one of the popular leaders at the time of the first secession. He reminds his hearers that the people were never put to any disadvantage by the kings, and least of all by the last ones. He recalls an occasion on which the king had distributed 5 minae of silver to every man, and reminds the patricians how the plebeians had rejected the great gifts that the banished Tarquins had offered them as an inducement to break faith with the patrician government. It may well have been from similar fears that in the following year the remainder of the Tarquins' property was distributed among the people, bona regia diripienda plebi sunt data. A few chapters later Livy states that so long as the banished Tarquin was still alive, the people received from the Senate multa blandimenta. The nobles are described by Dionysius as taking many measures friendly to the poor, that they might not go over to the tyrants and be won over by considerations of personal gain and betray the commonwealth. The Senate seems to have been fighting the Tarquins with their own weapons. The blandimenta that kept Superbus off the throne may well have been synonymous with the benignitas that got Priscus onto it. After the death of Tarquin at the court of the Greek tyrant at Cumae, there were 3 prominent Romans who rightly or wrongly were suspected of aiming at the kingly power. It may be worthwhile examining in each of the 3 cases the circumstances that are said to have given rise to these suspicions. Spurius Cassius is not described as having been personally very rich, and our authors introduce into their accounts of him nothing to support the charge that he was aiming at overthrowing the existing government. They leave it possible to conceive of him as a constitutional reformer who, when consul, sought to relieve a widespread distress by distributions of land and perhaps corn, and by taking the state finances into his own hands. The outcry against him is made to come mainly from the landed classes who fear that his proposals may touch their own pockets. As far as they are thinking about the constitution, it is the financial position that the consul has created for himself that is the chief ground of their alarms. By his distributions of money, the consul was erecting a power perilous to liberty. The way was being paved to monarchy. Later on we find Cassius having money dealings with the people. He proposes that the sums that they have paid the government for corn brought from Sicily in time of famine should be refunded to them, but this was looked on by the plebeians as a cash payment for the throne, and refused, though there is nothing to show that the Cassius of Livy and Dionysius had either the desire or the real equipment to repeat the career of Tarquinius Priscus. Yet the narrative about him is none the less relevant. It depicts the early republican as deeply alarmed at any individual who secures any kind of financial predominance in the state. Very possibly this feeling may account for the ostentatious exhibition of poverty in which early republican nobles are so often depicted as indulging. In the case of Spurius Maelius there are no such complications. If we accept Livy and Dionysius, Maelius' policy did not threaten the property of any of the nobles. The fears that he would restore the kingship may have been mistaken, but they were almost certainly genuine. Is there any resemblance between extant accounts of Maelius' career and the speculations that we have been engaged in as to the early history of the first Tarquin? There is not only a resemblance but a striking one. Maelius was extremely rich, not dives merely but predives. When he set about relieving Rome from famine, he was able to do so not only at his own expense but through his own clients and connections, buying up corn at his own expense through the agency of his friends Hospitum and clients. Marcus Manlius, the third to be condemned to death for aiming at the throne, need not detain us. He is essentially a military character, like his contemporary Dionysius of Syracuse. But the real bulwark of the Republic of the 5th century, as it appears in the pages of our authors, is not the right arm of Servilius Ahala. It is a fundamental change that came over the lower classes of the free population. In a passage of Livy that has already been quoted, Brutus is made to charge the Tarquins with having converted the men of Rome from soldiers into artisans and quarimen opifices aci lapicidas. Brutus had just effected a revolution at Rome. To represent a revolution as a return to antiquity was as natural with the Roman as it is with us. It is possible, though improbable, that the Tarquins had turned the plebeians from soldiers into artisans. The situation clearly indicated by Brutus is that he and his fellow nobles are turning them from artisans into soldiers. It is not merely in the speeches put by Livy and Dionysius into the mouths of Brutus and his colleagues that we find the establishment of the Republic associated with a reorganization of the state upon a military basis. The development of the comitia centuriata as the main organization of the citizens of Rome for political purposes is associated with the beginnings of the Republic. The centuries were originally and fundamentally a military organization. The agrarian measures that appear so early in the narratives of the historians need not deceive us. As far as they are authentic, they must have been either insincere or idealist. The republican nobility is painted from the first as teaching the distressed plebeians to look not for farms and allotments but for wars and prize money. The picture of the transfiguration of the plebeians into soldiers is completed in the narrative of the siege of VIII 406,396 before Christ. When pay for military service is introduced, and war becomes a leading means of earning a livelihood. In short, it would appear that the nobles ceased to dread a restoration of the monarchy otherwise than by armed force when and only when their government became the principal and most popular employer in the state. The Alcmeonidae at Athens put an end to the possibility of a revival of the tyranny and incidentally to all respect for constructive manual labor by instituting state payments for services as jurymen, sailors on warships, and the like. Conditions at Rome were in some ways very different from those at Athens. But the Roman nobles appear to have aimed at securing the same result as the Athenian, by very similar means. How far this parallel holds, at least as between the extant narratives, may be illustrated from the history of the family that took the leading place in the early Roman Republic. The part played by Brutus in the narrative is politically as insignificant as that of Harmodius in the overthrow of the tyranny at Athens. The political geniuses of the early Roman Republic are all to be found in the great house of the Claudii. Our accounts make the family first come to Rome in the 6th year of the Republic. The head of the family at that time is described by Dionysius as of noble birth and influential through his wealth. He arrives, bringing with him a great establishment and numerous friends and retainers. Mommsen gives strong reasons for thinking that the family cannot have first come to Rome at so late a date. But the arrival may well have been a return from exile like that of the Alcmeonidae to Athens after the fall of Hippias. The analogies between the Claudii and the Alcmeonidae deserve consideration, the more so as they seem to be uninfluenced by any ancient recognition of their existence. It looks as though the wealthy Claudii, like the wealthy Alcmeonidae, took the commons into partnership. Mommsen has pointed out how many well-known traits of the ancient Tyrannus occur in the picture of the decemvir Appius. His contemporary Pericles was called the new Pisistratus. If there are such strong reasons for equating the early Claudii, whose historical existence can scarcely be seriously questioned, with the contemporary Alcmeonidae, it becomes increasingly probable that the history of Rome and Athens in the 6th century ran on parallel lines. One great difference between 5th century Rome and 5th century Athens was that Athens had had her own coinage from well back into the 6th century, whereas Rome, as already mentioned, struck her first pieces about 338 before Christ. No famous name is associated with these earliest pieces. The most prominent man in Rome during the first generation after 338 was another Claudius, the censor Appius Claudius Caecus. His greatest achievement was the epoch-making Via Appia, the first of the great series of roads that knit together the Roman Empire. The city owed to him also its first aqueduct. On these great public works he spent, without the previous sanction of the Senate, the money accumulated in the treasury. The sums thus spent must have represented the first large accumulation of the new Roman currency. Appius' connection with the early coinage of Rome was probably not confined to spending it. The second series of Roman es gros was coined in Campania and bears on the reverse a wheel fig. 33. Numismatists have long associated the appearance of this wheel with the construction of the Appian Way that led from Rome to the Campanian capital. One detail only is wanted to complete the picture of a potential tyrant of the early Greek type, such as has been depicted in every section of this volume, and that feature appears in Valerius Maximus. According to that writer, who flourished early in the 1st century A.D., Appius possessed plurimus clientelas. All this gives added significance, in the light of our inquiries, to a brilliant conjecture of Mommsen, that Appius actually attempted to make himself tyrant. Mommsen relies mainly on a sentence in Suetonius which runs, Claudius Drusus, after a crowned statue had been set up to him at Epiphorum, endeavored by means of his clients' clientelas to seize Italy. The context dates the event between the Decemvirate and the First Punic War. The possible period is further limited by the fact that Epiphorum was only founded by Appius Claudius Caecus. The name of the would-be tyrant as given by Suetonius is Claudius Drusus, but this, Mommsen shows, must be corrupt. The mention of Epiphorum points definitely to Appius Claudius Caecus, the only person whose name is associated with the place. In another passage of his history, Mommsen himself observes how Appius shows the spirit of the Tarquins. If we look at the history of the early republic from the plebeian point of view, there is at least one important feature in the extant narratives that supports our main conclusions. The most notable weapon that the 5th century plebeians are represented as employing against the nobles is the secession. The first is recorded under the year of Spurius Cassius' consulship, when the men whom Tarquin is accused of having made into artisans and quarrymen proceeded in a body to the Mons Sacer outside the city, and refused to come back and resume work until their grievances had been dealt with. The resemblance of the secession to the modern strike has already been recognized. It may be an accident, but if so it is a remarkable one, that the chief weapon of the class on which Tarquin's power appears to have rested should have been one that reappears in history with the organization of the industrial classes in modern times. Before we proceed to discuss the value of the narratives that we have been quoting, there are a few further notices in them that have a place in this discussion. Though they deal not with Rome but with other cities of central Italy. In 440 before Christ, the plebeians of Ardea, a city about 20 miles east of Rome, are described by Livy as engaged in a struggle with the Optimates, and as getting the worst of it. Thereupon the losing party, quite unlike the Roman plebs, prepared to besiege the city, i.e. Ardea, with a crowd of workmen opifecum, attracted by the prospect of plunder. The Latin leaves it possible that the crowd of workmen opifecum with which the plebs of Ardea prepared to besiege their city should be understood as a separate body. Conceivably metics or slaves. At VIII in 400 before Christ the artifices are said to have been slaves. But, though in Etruria in 400 before Christ this may have been normally the case, in Latin Ardea 40 years earlier we may well have conditions not unlike those that have been inferred above for 6th century Rome. Livy is thinking of the Roman plebeians of the early Republican period, not of the Opiphaces and Lapicidae of the age of the Tarquins, when he says that the plebs of Ardea was quite unlike the Roman plebs. In the year 400 before Christ, according to Livy, the people of VIII, tedeo annui ambitionis, regem croer. Nothing is said by Livy about feelings and parties in VIII itself, except this statement that they were bored with annual elections. All that Livy mentions is the way in which the appointment was received elsewhere in Etruria. The event, he says, gave offense to the peoples of Etruria. Their hatred of kingly power was not greater than that which they felt against the king personally. He had previously made himself generally unpopular by his wealth and arrogance opibus superbiac. He had once brought a solemn celebration of the games to a violent conclusion, indignant at having been rejected by the votes of the 12 peoples in favor of another candidate for the priesthood. He had suddenly, in the middle of the performance, withdrawn the workmen artifices, a great part of whom were his own slaves. The result of the Veientines' wealth had been, according to Livy, to make him unpopular. But it is a reasonable inference from Livy's narrative that he was unpopular only with the aristocrats who continued to control the government in the other cities of Etruria. His accession can hardly have been disagreeable to the Veientines who made him king. As noticed just above before he became king, he had also been the employer and actually the owner of a great proportion of the artifices of the city. It is nowhere stated that the artifices helped to make him king in VIII as they had helped to make him unpopular in the rest of Etruria, but the important part played by the Opiphaces at Ardea a generation previously suggests that this may well have been the case. If the events took place as recorded, it is hard to believe that there was not some connection between the Veientine's royal power and his previous riches and control of the skilled labor of the city. So far we have been assuming that the extant accounts of the Tarquins have a historical basis. That assumption, as remarked already, is by no means beyond dispute. Not a statement has been quoted so far in this chapter that has not within the last century been pronounced to be historically worthless. Recently, however, there has been a movement to treat the narrative with much more respect than it generally received a generation ago. The new attitude is not merely a reaction against the excessive skepticism of the 19th century. Largely, it is based on fresh evidence, mainly archaeological. Inscriptions show that writing was no extraordinary accomplishment at Rome in those early days. Excavations of cities that have been sacked make it most unlikely that the sack of Rome in 390 before Christ meant the complete destruction of the city records. In the face of facts like these, more weight is now given to passages where our authorities for the history of 6th and 5th century Rome allude to more or less contemporary records. Whether Roman or Greek, the evidence for falsification and invention is indeed considerable, but it is now for the most part realized that the critics of the 19th century greatly overestimated its application. The credibility of early Roman history is too big a subject to deal with at all adequately in a work like this. It is necessary, however, to examine more in detail those parts of the narrative with which this inquiry is more particularly concerned. Some scholars are still to be found who dispute in toto the Tarquins' historical existence. Of this ultra-skeptical school, the most recent and voluminous exponent is Professor Pies of Naples. Pies accepts nearly all the views of nearly all the skeptics insofar as they are purely destructive. But the main inspiration of his unbelief is not this destructive criticism, but the ease with which he finds that he can explain the growth of our narratives on the assumption that they are false. In the case of the Tarquins, Pies first points out in the usual way the inconsistencies and impossibilities and reduplications in the narrative, and the uncertainties that hang over it as a whole. Then, after rejecting it as history, he accounts for it as myth. He equates Tarquinius philologically with Tarpeius. The Tarpeian rock was the slope of the Roman capital over which condemned criminals were hurled to meet their doom. There are passages in Varro and elsewhere that make it possible that the whole capital was once called the Tarpeian Mount. On the strength of them, Tarquinius is explained as Tarpeius, the original guardian deity of the Roman citadel. All the stories told about Tarquin are, according to Pies, attempts to explain customs and buildings and natural features connected with the Tarpeian Mount. Hence his association with the temple on the top of the Capitol and with the quarries on its sides. Hence the stories of his cruelty and of his own violent death. Hence, too, we hear of Tarquinian laws. They are merely laws passed on the Mons Tarpeius or sanctioned by the god Tarpeius. I do not propose to deal in detail with these criticisms. They do not seem to me to need it. So many unquestionably historical characters would succumb to Pies' treatment. Imagine for a moment that the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle had never circulated, and that the original had perished in a Danish raid. Imagine further that Asser's Life of Alfred had met with a similar fate. Both calamities might easily have happened, and if they had, King Alfred would be as easily disposed of as King Tarquin himself. Alfred did none of the things that tradition ascribes to him. He did not institute trial by jury or the division of England into shires. He was not the founder either of University College, Oxford, or of the British Navy. The stories of his victories over the Danes are extremely doubtful on the face of them. Alfred does not conquer his enemies, he merely converts them. The legend admits that he had his headquarters in an impassable swamp, and that the conquered Danes ruled the country. Twice in 2 centuries the Danish invaders sweep over England after the death of a King Ethelred. Both times there is a campaign on the Berkshire Downs. The decisive battle is fought in the first case at Ashdown, in the second at Essenjune, which is palpably a mere variation of the same name. In each case, the conquest is succeeded by the reign of Saxon Edward. The second Edward is admitted by tradition to have been less concerned with royalty than with religion. The first will be shown in a moment to have been the son of a god. Elder as applied to the first Edward is neither more nor less suspicious than Priscus as applied to Tarquin. This simple device of duplication probably explains the story of Alfred in Athelney. It is a reflection backwards of the story, possibly historical, of Hereward's exploits in the similar swampy fastness of Ely. The one legend that remains inextricably associated with Alfred is that of the cakes. Alfred the fugitive in his Arician grove at Athelney is made known to his followers only after the burning of the cakes. The inference is obvious. Alfred is a vegetation deity of the same order as Demeter, the wandering goddess who was found by the mistress of the house, where she sought refuge, burning not cakes but Triptolemus the corn god himself. The mistress of the house appears also in the Alfred myth. But in other ways, and especially in the recognition scene, the story has been obviously contaminated by Christian influence. So far, therefore, from dismissing the cake story from Alfred's history, we find that it is the very essence of the legend. In fact, when we recall such divinities as Dionysus Batris, Dionysus the grape, we must be tempted to wonder whether King Alfred and his cakes are not one and the same divinity. The introduction of the Greek Demaratus into the Tarquin story has sometimes been regarded with extreme suspicion. For the late Professor Pelham, it seems to have been a proof that Tarquin was merely Herodotus translated into Latin. He uses it as such in a handbook on Roman history. The story of the voyage of Demaratus stands on quite a different footing from the long speech put by Dionysius into the mouth of Brutus, in which the founder of the Roman Republic is made to quote the double kingship at Sparta as a precedent for the double consulship. Brutus' speech is palpable fiction. The Demaratus story, on the other hand, may indeed have been borrowed from that of Philip the son of Buticides, who in the last quarter of the 6th century fled from Croton with his own trireme and a crew of his own employees and sailed first to Cyrene and then with Dorius the Spartan to Sicily. where they tried to establish a settlement, but were killed by the Phoenicians and Egestians. But if on other and independent grounds we find reason for thinking that the story of Demaratus' voyage in the 7th century is in the main outline historical, then we may reasonably find a confirmation of it in the well-attested facts of Philip's adventures in the century following. In the statement that Caere, the southern neighbor of Tarquinii, contained a Greek element at the time of the Tarquins, and further in the fact that Demaratus is made to quit Corinth at a time when we have the authority of Herodotus for believing that many prominent Corinthians were being driven to quit their city. The migration of the Tarquins from Tarquinii to Rome corresponds with the Etrusco-Carthaginian alliance against the Greeks, of which the best remembered fact is the subsequent disaster that overtook the Phocians in Corsica in 536 before Christ. When the Tarquins are banished from Rome, they flee to the Greek city of Cumae, while the Romans who have banished them proceed to make an alliance with Carthage. All through the Tarquin narrative, we may discern a strictly historical background that fully explains their comings and goings. The same may, of course, be said of countless heroes of modern historical romances. But in these historical romances, the fictitious characters seldom play the leading political part that is played by the tyrant kings of the Tarquin dynasty. The evidence of institutions also tends rather against the skeptics. Cicero notes that the organization which Tarquinius Priscus was said to have introduced for maintaining the Roman cavalry was the same in principle as that which had once prevailed in Corinth. The skeptics may indeed argue that the Corinthian character of the Roman practice was the reason why it was attributed to the son of Demaratus. This line of argument rests on pure assumption, and leaves with its advocate the onus of explaining this similarity between the institutions of Corinth and Rome. There is, in fact, another source of evidence now available which greatly alters the balance of probabilities. Cicero may after all be right when he says inflixit non tenuis quidem e Graecia realis in hanc urbum, sed abundantissimis amnes ilarum disciplinarum et artium, and proceeds at once to illustrate his statement from the career of Demaratus. At the time when the story makes Demaratus leave Corinth for Etruria, Corinth was probably the chief industrial state in Greece. Her chief industry was pottery. Corinthian pottery of this period has been found in many parts of the Greek world, including the chief cities of Etruria. At Corneto Tarquinii, the town from which Tarquinius Priscus is said to have migrated to Rome. Many specimens from the necropolis of the ancient city are to be seen in the museum. An example is shown in Fig. 34. Unless the Corinthian pottery found in such distant regions as Etruria has distinct local peculiarities, it is generally assumed to have been imported from Greece. Corinth did unquestionably export pottery. A Corinthian terracotta tablet has come down to us, see Fig. 35, that depicts a ship surmounted by a row of vases that can only represent the cargo. The wide area of its distribution and the very numerous sites on which it has been found point to export from a single center. On the other hand, a large export trade from one main center is quite consistent with branch establishments. If Corinthian potters went to Etruria, it is hard to see how we are to distinguish the vases they made before leaving home from those that they produced afterwards. The question whether the characteristic pale clay of the Corinthian pottery is to be found in central Italy does not arise. The raw material would be imported quite as easily as the finished product, but there is other archaeological evidence that takes us further and makes it not only possible but probable that Greek potters as well as Greek pottery found their way to Etruria at the period to which the Demaratus story, if historical, must be assigned, i.e., about the middle of the 7th century. I refrain purposely at this point from drawing my own conclusions, and shall confine myself to the views and statements of archaeologists who have devoted special attention to the material in question. In the 7th century graves that have been found in so many cities of Etruria there occur, besides objects that may well be imported from Greece, many others that are essentially Greek in character, but show local peculiarities. For instance, at Caere, which was so closely connected with Tarquinii and Rome, in the famous tomb excavated in 1836 by General Galassi and the archpriest Regulini, a quantity of metal work of this description was found. The tomb has been recently reopened, and the contents discussed at length by G. Pinza. On some of the vases of a very familiar Greek type found in the same grave, Pinza remarks that the coarse clay allows us to imagine that they are of local fabric. When we come to Central Italian finds that date from the 6th century Greek objects, that there is good reason for regarding as locally produced become positively plentiful. They include vases and bronzes, architectural terracottas, and sepulchral frescoes. Such a mass of material points again to a large number of Greek or Greek-trained workmen in central Italy at the time of its production. And though that time is rather later than Demaratus and the objects are Ionic, not Corinthian, yet it increases the plausibility of the Demaratus story, the more so as the change from Corinthian to Ionic reflects the policy ascribed in our ancient literary authorities to Servius Tullius. Those who deny the historical existence of Demaratus naturally deny also that of his Greek workmen Eucher and Eugramus. Even Rizzo, who admits a historical basis for the Demaratus story, declares that these names are obviously fictitious. The taint of the ultra-skeptical school still lingers. Else why should a countryman of Tintoretto say that Eucher and Eugramus are obviously fictitious names? In spite of its obvious fictitiousness, the name Eucheros was actually borne by a Greek potter, several of whose vases have come down to us signed Eucheros made me, the son of Ergotimos. This Eucheros, the son of Ergotimos, itself a good industrial name, lived not in the 7th century, but in the 6th also. He was not a Corinthian but an Athenian. But even if we refrain from emphasizing the pride of family which his signature shows as compared with that of most potters, who sign with only their own names, and refrain too from recalling the facts that Greeks so very frequently bore the names of their grandfathers, and that potters like Amasis almost certainly migrated to Athens about the middle of the 6th century, and Athens was supplanting the rest of Greece and more particularly Corinth in the pottery industry, Still, the 6th century Athenian Eucheros completely disposes of the obvious fictitiousness of one detail of the Demaratus story. So far from being obviously fictitious, the Corinthian Eucher has every appearance of historical reality. So too has his alleged relationship to the founder of the Tarquin dynasty at Rome. If the first tyrant of Corinth got his name from a pot, and very possibly owed his tyranny to the Corinthian potteries, it is not surprising if a Corinthian emigrant to Italy took potters with him and used them to build up the position which enabled him to make himself tyrant in the city of his adoption. In both cases we are dealing with conjectures, but it may be fairly claimed that the two conjectures lend one another mutual support. There are no traditions connecting Servius with Corinth. Such notices as we have of his relations with the Greeks connect him with Ionia. Both Livy and Dionysius and also Aurelius Victor state that Servius built a temple of Artemis and made it the center of a Latin league. In imitation of the temple of Artemis at Ephesus, which was the meeting place of the Ionian League. It has already been suggested that Servius' monetary reforms may have a historical basis and be due to intercourse with the Phocians, who had founded Marseilles in 600 before Christ. The city of Phocia, though in Aeolian territory, was reckoned Ionian. The Ionizing Servius is said to have reigned from 578 to 534 before Christ in the middle of the 6th century. Or, in other words, at just the same period, a corresponding change occurs in the archaeological finds, in which experts are agreed in recognizing Ionian influence if not Ionian workmanship. Among the objects which display the new style are the vases known as Caretan hydri and Pontic amphorae, and a group that has been classified as among the latest products of Clazomni, and a group of bronzes from Perugia. Of the 6th century examples of the famous frescoes that adorn or disfigure the chamber tombs of Etruria, some have been attributed to Ionian artists, as have also architectural terracottas of the same period found in Latium, at Cinca, the ancient Satricum, and Velletri. In dealing with the architectural terracottas from Cinca, Rizzo suggests that the potters who worked there came from Cumae or some other Greek city in Campania. In this connection he remarks that so far the traces of intercourse between Rome and Campania during the first 2 centuries of the city i.e. 750,550 before Christ seem rather scanty. He attributes this to gaps in excavation. Once more he seems not to notice that the negative archaeological evidence harmonizes with the literary tradition. Cumae must have been powerfully influencing Rome in the very early days when the Romans borrowed the Cumaean alphabet. But then comes a period when Cumae is eclipsed by Corinth. Cumae only begins to recover her influence Romewards when Corinthian influence is on the wane. The Tarquins' story begins at Corinth. It ends at Cumae, where Superbus, when banished from Rome, is said to have sought refuge with Aristodemus, who was perhaps the last Greek tyrant of the old commercial type. It has been argued that nobody could have built shops in the Forum in the time of the Tarquins, because recent excavations have shown that till a comparatively late date the Forum was used as a cemetery, that apart from this, arcades and shops must have been impossible in the Forum until it had been drained, and that the building of the main drain, the Cloaca Maxima, ascribed to Tarquin by Livy, has been shown by excavation to belong to a very much later age. As regards the main drain, archaeology has indeed shown that it was bricked and vaulted at a late date, but there is no reason for thinking that it began its existence with the masonry that now encloses it. The London Fleet and Tyburn suggest the opposite. The most recent volume on the subject is emphatic on this point. The earliest Roman sewer consisted undoubtedly of a natural watercourse, the channel of which was widened and deepened. There is no doubt that the first attempts at artificial drainage date from the regal period. The first part of the city to be drained was the Forum Valley. Those who maintain a post-regal date for the building of the Forum base their arguments on the finds of pottery in the Forum graves. The finds have been numerous and their evidence is valuable, and it is necessary briefly to review it. The latest style of pottery found in these graves is the Proto-Corinthian. This very distinctive and widely distributed pottery has been the subject of much controversy as regards its place of origin. But its chronology is well established. It flourished in the 7th century, of which at least 2 lived on in a degraded form into the 5th. Vases of this style quoted by Boni as coming from 2 of the latest graves in the Forum are illustrated in the Notizie digli Scavi Fig. 36. Both the vases illustrated might well be 7th century. At Ritsona in Boeotia the types were completely obsolete by the middle of the 6th century, not one example occurring among some 2,500 vases excavated from graves of the latter half of the century. This mass of pottery included about 150 Proto-Corinthian vases, but the number is divided about equally between Chthons like J. H.S. Roman 31, p. 75, Fig. 4, and small skyphoi such as J. H.S. Roman 29, p. 319, Fig. 7, number 9, with just 2 or 3 pikesides like J. H.S. Roman 29, p. 312, Fig. 2, no. 8. In the Forum graves, there are a certain number of vases of other styles that cannot be dated so accurately as the Proto-Corinthian but suggest on stylistic grounds a somewhat later date. None of them, however, would naturally be put later than towards the end of the 6th century, and very few so late as that. Occasional burials of a later date would be evidence for a later conversion from cemetery to forum only if intramural burials were unknown in Rome. As a matter of fact, there is explicit evidence that they took place. After what has been said about the Tarquins and 6th century Rome generally, it is scarcely necessary to discuss in detail the historicity of Servius Tullius. For representative modern views on him, see Müller. Deke Servius symbolizes the supremacy of Volsinii. The Tarquins that of Tarquinii. De Sanctis Servius is the Etruscan invader who drove out the Tarquins. Gardthausen Servius is the Roman counterpart of the Greek tyrant, the Tarquins the legitimate kings, leaders of the rich and noble. This whole chapter is a refutation of Gardthausen's view about the Tarquins. The other suggestions are compatible with my own. Etruria may well have exercised as strong an influence on a 6th-century tyranny at Rome as did Persia on those of 6th-century Ionia. Pies fancifully explains Servius as the priest-god, the Ceres Rex of Aricia, who was imported to Rome in 338 before Christ, well known to English readers as the priest who slew the slayer, and shall himself be slain. Mastarna is differentiated from Servius, and said to have a historical prototype in Mezentius, the enemy of Aeneas. My criticisms of Pies in reference to the Tarquins are equally applicable here. In the early period of the Roman Republic, the chief Greek influence, to judge from the narratives, was that of Athens and the Alcmeonidae. Once more we find the written documents and the archaeological evidence in agreement. During the second half of the 6th century, Attic imports had been gaining a great preponderance in central Italy. Thus, from the time when the Greek Demaratus is said to have settled in Tarquinii to that at which the last Roman Tarquin is said to have sought shelter in the Greek Cumae, the series of Greek connections implied in our narrative is found reflected in the results of excavations. We have based our conclusions on a mass of material from various sites scattered all over central Italy. The evidence from Rome itself could not have been made the basis of the discussion. It is not sufficiently abundant. Its scantiness, however, need cause no misgivings. It is sufficiently accounted for by the unbroken ages of crowded occupation that differentiate Rome from the surrounding cities. The finds from Rome, as far as they go, confirm the other evidence by showing that first Corinth, then Ionia, and finally Athens did actually influence Rome during the period of the last royal dynasty. Corinthian vases have been found in the city from time to time, though not, it should be noticed, in the Forum cemetery. The influence of Ionia in the 6th century is seen in such objects as a series of cups closely resembling the later Ionic vases of the Munich catalogue, or again in a bearded antifix fig, 37 found near the church of S. Antonia, and compared by Pinza with examples published by Bohlau in his Os Ionischian Necropole and fig. 38, or yet again in the archaic terracotta head fig. 39 found in 1876 near the church of the Aracoli on the Capitol, which much resembles the stone head fig. 40 from the Athenian Acropolis, described by Dickens as an undoubtedly early example of imported Chiot art. An amphora in the Attic black figure style fig. 41 has been found on the Quirinal. The most exquisite early Attic is reported by Boni from the Palatine. Attic Ionic influence has been seen in the Capitoline she-wolf fig. 42, which is held by Peterson to commemorate the expulsion of the kings, and may be compared with the statue of a lioness put up at Athens to commemorate Leina, the mistress of the tyrannicide Aristogiton. This completes the evidence for the credibility of our narrative. It is not conclusive. The archaeological material on which we have had so largely to rely, though it reflects the various Greek influences that are said to have affected their history, does not, for instance, establish Demaratus as a historical character, but it does fully establish him as a historical possibility. It disposes us to give much more weight than was customary a generation ago to statements and allusions that tend to confirm the historical basis of our narratives. We no longer pass over the possibility that Demaratus may have been a living prototype of Philip the son of Butasides, and not a mere study in fiction based on the career of the adventurous Crotonian. In the light of the extremely rich collection of Greek pottery from Caere, the childish story told by Strabo of how Caere got its name from the Greek no longer discounts his other statement in the same passage, that in early times the city had a treasury at Delphi. A statement that is confirmed by Herodotus, who tells us that the people of Caere consulted the Delphic oracle about the year 540 before Christ. In short, there is every possibility that Tarquin at Rome may have had consciously before his eyes the career of Cypselus at Corinth. The accounts here offered both of the Tarquins and of the Corinthian tyrants are admittedly conjectural, but when two such conjectures based on independent evidence are found to harmonize so well both with one another and with a broad general explanation of the narratives they deal with, it may be fairly claimed that they render one another mutual support. But let us for the moment adopt the attitude of the skeptics and assume the whole story of the Tarquins to be false. In that case, the numerous Greek elements can be explained only as plagiarisms from the corresponding figures in Greek history. The 7th and 6th century tyrants. But the Greek element includes the story of Demaratus and his Corinthian workmen and his wealth, and the part that these played in the events that led up to his son Tarquinius Priscus becoming king of Rome. In other words, for the hypothetical authors of this hypothetical fiction, the typical early Greek tyrant was a great capitalist and a great employer. Chapter Roman 9, Sicyon, Megara, Miletus, Ephesus, Leontini, Agrigentum, Cumi. Ni pertins rein du pass. Si nest quavic le pass quant fate l'avenir. Anatole, France. The tyranny at Sicyon lasted longer than in any other Greek state. It started about the same time as that of Cypselus at Corinth, and continued in the same family for about a century. The tyrants rested their power on the support of the pre-Dorian population of their city, and the establishment of the tyranny was probably to a large extent a racial movement representing a rising of the pre-Dorian stratum of the population against their Dorian conquerors. How the tyrant family secured its power is another question. Until the other day, our only information on the subject was to the effect that the founder of the dynasty was a cook or butcher, who was helped to power by the Delphic oracle, thanks however to a papyrus recently unearthed by the Oxford scholars Grenfell and Hunt, and published by them in 1915, we have now considerable fragments of a detailed account of the founder of the dynasty. The fragment confirms the statement that the tyrants of Sicyon were sprung from a butcher, and settles the vexed question of the relationship of Andreas and Orthagoras, the two earliest known members of the family, by showing that Orthagoras was the first tyrant and Andreas was father of Orthagoras. It also shows that Orthagoras himself was bred as a butcher, but it is devoted mainly to the military exploits of the youthful Orthagoras, and though it does not take us down to the day when he made himself tyrant, it plainly brings us very near it. And as it leaves him in the position of polemarch on active service, it seems to illustrate and support the statement of Aristotle that the early tyrants often owed their power to some high magistracy or military position that they had previously secured in the state. But there are several reasons why this military aspect should not be overrated. The account of how Orthogoras actually seized the tyranny is after all wanting. The extant fragment says that he secured the position of polemarch partly also by reason of the goodwill of the mass of the citizens towards him, and gives this as a separate reason from that of his military successes. Moreover, the author of the fragment was possibly Aristotle himself, who is known to have written a lost constitution of the Sicyonians. And although Grenfell and Hunt regard Ephorus as more probably the author, Ephorus lived at the same time and wrote under the same historical influences as Aristotle, and was probably misled in the same way concerning the character of the early tyranny. The outstanding fact in the early career of Orthogoras is still his tradesman origin. Little is known of the later career of Orthogoras except that he governed mildly, and of his successor Myron, Olympian victor, in 648 before Christ nothing is recorded that throws any direct light on the origin of the tyranny, but the case is different when we come to Cleisthenes. The last and most famous of this family of tyrants, whose reign covered roughly the first third of the 6th century. With Cleisthenes, the Sicyonian tyranny entered on a new phase. Aristotle quotes Sicyon as an instance of a city where the government changed from tyranny to tyranny. From that of Myron to that of Cleisthenes. The story of how Cleisthenes got his 2 brothers out of the way is told by Nicolaus Damascenus. But what Nicolaus gives is purely a tale of domestic crime, a change from tyrant to tyrant, not from tyranny to tyranny. Perhaps the change referred to by Aristotle is to be connected with the fact that Cleisthenes followed an aggressive foreign policy. He was violently hostile to Argos, and took a leading part in the sacred war that was fought about Delphi at the beginning of the 6th century before Christ. He was a contemporary of Periander, who appears to have changed the character of the tyranny at Corinth by making the government warlike. It is not unlikely that the change effected by Cleisthenes at Sicyon was in the same direction. In turning to war, it does not follow that he forsook trade. He may have held the view that trade follows the flag. The sacred war had its secular side. It arose about the refusal of the people of Crisa, who possessed the port of Delphi, to remove their harbor dues. Crisa was a place of importance in early times, so much so that what was later known as the Gulf of Corinth was called the Gulf of Crisa. The territory of the Crisaeans lay just opposite Sicyon, and it seems not improbable that the Sicyonians, with their allies the Corinthians, aimed at wresting from their rivals across the water their position in the Gulf, which was the starting point of trade with the far west. According to a Pindar scholiast, the Crisaeans had control of the sea at the beginning of the war and owed their ultimate defeat to the fact that Cleisthenes built a fleet and destroyed their naval supremacy. It looks very much as though Cleisthenes was trying to win for Sicyon the sea-borne trade that had been flowing into Crisa. With the aid of a fleet that must for the time have made Sicyon a really important naval power, he crushes the trade rival across the water and wins its place for his own city and himself. Berry assigns to Cleisthenes the leading part in the reorganizing of the Pythian games at Delphi after the Sacred War, and pictures the Sicyonian tyrant as doing for the Delphic Pythia much what Periander and Pisistratus are depicted as doing for the Corinthian Isthmia, and the Athenian Panathenaea, and Phaedon very possibly did for the great games at Olympia. Berry's general picture of the early tyrants as founders or reorganizers of these great Greek games is quite in harmony with the chronological evidence and with all that is known about the various tyrants' activities and characters. Developing these games might well be part of a broad commercial policy, the more so as the games were under divine patronage and ensured periodic opportunities for peaceful intercourse in an age of chronic warfare. Under such circumstances, gatherings of this kind naturally tend to become the commercial affair that the Delian festival admittedly grew to be. Everything known about the early Greek tyrants shows how capable they were of turning such a tendency to good account. That Delphi in particular had from early times a commercial character has already been conjectured by Cornford. In the early years of the Sicyonian tyranny, the greatness of the Euboean cities Chalcis and Eretria had begun to be steadily on the decline. The time had come to change the course of the eastern part of this great trade route, and instead of Crisa, Delphi, Thebes, Euboea to substitute another line, in which Sicyon and probably Athens should be dominating points. This is probably what Cleisthenes had in view when he so strongly supported Solon in the Sacred War. It follows that to make him the founder of the Delphic Pythia is a view that cannot be accepted without reservations. The available evidence represents Cleisthenes as rather the rival than the champion of Delphi. A Pindar scholiast already quoted states that he instituted Pythian games in his own Sicyon. There is no other evidence for Pythian games at Sicyon, but Herodotus gives a long account of the way in which Cleisthenes radically reformed the chief existing festival in the city. This festival, like the Delphic Pythia of the days before the Sacred War, was devoted largely to musical and poetical competitions. Its patron was the ancient hero Adrastus, whose connections were all with Argos, the Dorian city whose influence in Sicyon Cleisthenes was bent on overthrowing. Cleisthenes ejected Adrastus from Sicyon by the curious process of burying beside him the body of his bitterest enemy, the Theban Melanippus, which he borrowed for the purpose from Thebes, and then removing the body of Adrastus, which was assumed to depart voluntarily from so unpleasant a neighborhood. The reformed festival was held in honor of this Theban hero and the Theban wine god Dionysus. The ejected Adrastus had been one of the leaders in the famous expedition of the Seven against Thebes. There can be little doubt that when the festival was instituted, Cleisthenes was aiming at an entente with the great inland city that formed the first main stage on the route from Delphi to Euboea and the north. But the attempt was a failure. Thebes was conspicuously unrepresented at the wooing of Cleisthenes' daughter Agariste, and the tyrant is furious when one of the suitors performs what has plausibly been suggested to have been a Theban dance. Relations with Delphi may have run a similar course. In the first celebration of the reformed Delphian Pythia, Cleisthenes competed, and the way that he approached the Delphic oracle before reorganizing his own Sicyonian festival shows that he wanted an understanding with the authorities there. to whom his family was perhaps largely indebted for its throne. But the oracle would have nothing to do with Cleisthenes' proposals and used abusive language to the tyrant for making them. Relations between the god and the tyrant can hardly have remained cordial after this incident, and the Thebans presumably sided with the god. Whatever the precise outcome of Cleisthenes' policy with Delphi and Thebes, the likelihood remains that one main object of that policy had been to give a new direction to the city's trade. We have been assuming that the Sicyon of the tyrants was an important center of commerce and industry. This has been denied by Eduard Mayer. The evidence is meager, but as far as it goes, it is entirely against Mayer's hypothesis, which makes it hard to explain how the city became so great and prosperous at this time. We have seen already that Cleisthenes possessed a powerful fleet, and that his proceedings suggest far-reaching commercial designs. The evidence as to industry points in the same direction. Some distinguished archaeologists have actually assigned to the Sicyon of Andreas and Orthogoras one of the leading industries of the period. The making of the remarkably fine pottery now usually known as Proto-Corinthian. Their arguments are by no means decisive, and in any case, there is nothing to associate the Sicyonian tyrants personally with Sicyonian potteries. But there are literary notices which point to the Orthogorids as having been, like the other early tyrants, builders and, presumably, employers of local labor. The Olympian treasury, which Pausanias thought to have been put up by the tyrant Myron, has been shown by excavation to have been 5th-century work. But in this treasury Pausanias saw 2 bronze chambers models of buildings, one of which bore an inscription saying that it was a dedication of Myron and the people of Sicyon. This inscription may have misled Pausanias into ascribing to Myron the building that contained it. The bronze chamber on which the dedication was inscribed was on a large scale. It weighed 500 Aeginetan talents, or about 19 tons. From towards the end of the period of the tyranny, Sicyon was famous for its school of sculptors, who worked largely in bronze, and though no statement has been preserved as to the workmanship of Myron's dedication, it may not unreasonably be used as evidence that the Sicyonians of his reign were already experts in the working of bronze. As regards buildings, Cleisthenes, with the spoils that he gained in the sacred war, is known to have erected at Sicyon a magnificent portico. Pollux, the lexicographer of the 2nd century A.D., says that the Sicyonians in the time of the tyrants, as also the Athenians, under the Pisistratids, wore a particular kind of rough woolen dress, that they might be ashamed to go down into the city. The statement may be true, and the explanation false. If both are accepted, it by no means follows that the policy of the Sicyonian tyrants was dominantly agricultural. We may possibly have here a record of a measure intended to prevent the commercialized city from attracting to itself the agricultural population that was of such vital importance to the normal self-sufficing Greek city-state. There is little doubt that the government of the Sicyonian tyrants was popular with the lower classes. Aristotle declares that it lasted so long because they treated their subjects so well. If Herodotus and Ephorus give a less favorable account of them, The reason is probably that their sources were aristocratic and anti-tyrannical. The tyranny at Megara is associated with the single name of Thegenes, whose reign is dated by the support that he gave to his son-in-law Cylon, winner of an Olympian victory in 640 before Christ, and would-be tyrant of Athens. According to Aristotle in the Rhetoric, Thegenes, like Pisistratus and Dionysius, scheming to make himself tyrant, asked for the usual bodyguard, and having secured it became tyrant. But as pointed out in the first chapter, this only shows that winning the tyranny meant possessing an armed force. It says nothing as to how the armed force was acquired. Armed forces are not to be had for the asking, for the way in which Thegenes got his our only evidence is another passage of Aristotle, this time from the Politics, which says that Thegenes secured his power after slaughtering the flocks and herds of the wealthy. In the latter part of the 5th century, most of the Megarians got their living by making examides, the normal dress of the poorer classes. Mayer assumes this to have been a 4th–6th century development, but altogether against the evidence. Not only is the woolen industry known to have been one of the main occupations of Megara in the 5th century, but the prosperity of the city in the 7th century is only comprehensible if we assume that it was already engaged in the woolen trade. As observed by Busolt, Megaris has on the whole a barren stony soil that was mostly suited only for the pasture of its numerous flocks of sheep. The Megarians must have manufactured goods to take to their distant colonies, from which they imported corn and other raw material. The colonial activities of Megara went back well into the 7th century. Some of her colonies, such as Chalcedon and Byzantium, and Heraclea Pontica, lay on the route of the Argonauts that led to the land of the Golden Fleece. Other 7th century colonies of Megara lay in the far west in Sicily, where she founded Megara Hyblia in the latter part of the 8th century and Selinus in the second half of the 7th. Thus Megara's colonial activities in the 7th century correspond closely with those of Miletus, the city that colonized most of the ports of the Black Sea, and owed so much of her wealth to her trade in wool with the Italian Sybaris. That Megara herself was engaged in the woolen industry at this early date is made not unlikely by several fragments of evidence. Demeter at Megara bore the title Malaphoros. Various statements, says Pausanias, are made about this title, and in particular that Demeter was named Malaphoros by those who first reared sheep in the land. The word Malaphoros may mean either sheep-bearing or apple-bearing, but the account of the title in Pausanias shows that the Megarians understood it as meaning sheep-bearing, and regarded it as of high antiquity and certainly as older than the days when the flocks of the well-to-do were slaughtered by Thegenes. According to Pliny, fulling was invented by a Megarian named Nicias. Buch-Sinstuits infers from this passage that fulling or milling was of great importance in the ancient wool industry. Lunar quotes it to prove the importance of the industry at Megara. The most important inference to be drawn from it both of them seem to have overlooked, namely that the industry at Megara must have been of high antiquity. The care bestowed by the Megarians on sheep breeding is alluded to by the 6th century Theognis. Megarian woolen goods at the end of the 5th century were much worn by Athenian slaves who, as Cower observes, came largely from the region of the early Megarian colonies. It seems therefore not unlikely that when Thegenes slaughtered the flocks of the wealthy at Megara, his blow was aimed at a class of capitalists whose wealth was already based on the woolen trade, as was that of the direct ancestors in Tudor times of our own modern capitalists. This possibility has been recognized by Pohlmann, who quotes Xenophon on the Megarian wool industry in reference to Thegenes. Pohlmann imagines the blow as dealt by the discontented masses, and inspired by simple hatred. But our one authority attributes it not to the rebellious masses, but to Thegenes himself. On a point of definite fact like this, Aristotle deserves to be taken precisely as he expresses himself. Can it be that Thegenes' coup was a simple but effective means of securing for himself the monopoly of the Megarian woolen industry? If this was in fact the aim of Thegenes, he was merely anticipating the methods of certain modern monopolists. In December 1888, the whiskey combination in the United States is said to have blown up a troublesome independent still in Chicago. There are records of a similar attempt to blow up rival works at Buffalo. For these cases, I quote again from a work on the danger of a new tyranny of wealth that the writer, whose book appeared in 1894, thought at the time to be threatening the United States. The most lasting memorial that Thegenes left behind him was the water conduit that he constructed for the city. The extant remains seem to belong to a later date, but this is no reason for either post-dating the tyrant or not accepting him as its constructor. The remains now to be seen may well be due to a reconstruction, perhaps by the famous Megarian Eupolinus, who constructed the Samian waterworks for Polycrates. Underground conduits like the Megarian were being made half a century before the reign of Thegenes, as is shown by the underground canal constructed by Hezekiah to bring to Jerusalem the waters of Miriam Gihon. Tyranny at Megara was short-lived. The only tyrant ended his life in exile. When they had banished Thegenes, the Megarians for a short while behaved with moderation. But after that they began behaving outrageously to the rich. In particular, the poor entered their houses, and demanded to be entertained and feasted sumptuously, and treated them all with violence and insult if they did not get what they desired. Finally, they passed a decree and recovered from the money-lenders the interest that they happened to have paid. This passage of Plutarch throws no direct light on either the character or the basis of Thegenes' power. The outbreak that it describes may have been due to the comparative weakness of the new government. It is equally possible that it occurred because the fall of the tyranny had made things much worse for the working classes, on whose support and favor Thegenes had probably based his power. This period of Megarian history is better known than the corresponding phase of any other Greek city, thanks to the verses of Theognis. Their evidence for the character of the early tyrannies has been discussed in Chapter I. If, as they're maintained, his exhortations not to be won over by gains to exalt any tyrant and his complaints about tradesmen controlling the state all point to fears of a tyranny of wealth, then it is particularly likely that his alarm may have had a historical basis in the career of Thegenes. At Miletus during the 7th and 6th centuries there appear to have been several periods of tyranny with intervals of anarchy in between. The most famous and powerful of the Milesian tyrants was Thrasobilis, whose reign must have begun towards the end of the 7th century. While he was tyrant, the city enjoyed great material prosperity. Then, in the middle of the 6th, she was afflicted with 2 generations of civil war, after which there came a great revival of prosperity under the tyrant Hiscius. Plutarch records the names of 2 other tyrants, Thoas and Damasner, but only to introduce an account of the state of things that followed their overthrow. They may have been joint successors of Thrasobilis, much as the Athenians tended to regard Pisistratus as having been succeeded by Hippias and Hipparchus ruling conjointly. Or possibly Plutarch is mentioning 2 successive rulers of a distinct period of tyranny, the latter of whom only was deposed, in which case they are probably to be put before Thrasobilis somewhere about the middle of the 7th century. The fall of Thoas and Damasner was followed by a struggle between 2 parties called Plautes and Charamash, names which sound remarkably like capital and labor. There is no certainty as to either the etymological or the historical meaning of these names. Plutarch seems to identify the Plautes faction with a body called Eonotai, always on shipboard, and the reading Plantes, connected with ship, has been proposed by Plas. Charamash again means not hand workers but hand fighters, a name that need not have any industrial implication. Hand fighters might be just people who did not wear swords, the lower classes generally. But Charamash is said by Eustathius to have been a synonym for, a common word for artisan, and Suidas speaks of rival parties in Miletus composed of the wealthy and the manual laborers. SV, explained as, and though the period to which he is referring is quite uncertain, he still lends some support to the capital and labor interpretation of Plutarch's Plautes and Charamash. The latter name would have been given to the party by its opponents, much as though enemies of a modern labor party should call them the strikers or down-toolers. The other name for labor or is said by Heraclides Ponticus to have been given to it by the faction of the wealthy, a statement quite compatible with the explanation of the name as derived from a place and denoting the poor subject Carians, the descendants of the pre-Hellenic population of the Milesian territory. Perhaps we may see a hint that Gergens and Charamash were alternative names both given to labor by its rich opponents in the reply given by the oracle to the party of the rich after they had been brutally massacring the party of the poor. I too says the god take heed of the murder of the unwarlike Gergines. The rebuke gains in point if the Gergines had been also called Charamachoi, the manual fighters. Of the early careers of the Milesian tyrants we know practically nothing. Aristotle indeed refers to Miletus as a place where tyranny arose from the great power possessed by the magistrate called Prytanes. As argued already in discussing the office of polemarch held before his tyranny by Cypselus, a position of this kind does not by itself explain a tyrant's rise to supreme power. Moreover, in the case of Miletus there is nothing to show which tyrant Aristotle is referring to. When on the throne, Thrasobilis pursued the policy of cutting off the heads of those ears of corn which he saw higher than the rest, or in other words, of putting to death those who were eminent among his subjects. It is fairly certain that a ruler who pursued this policy did not rest his power on the support of the upper classes. One of the few anecdotes about the tyrant tells how he outwitted the king of Lydia by a misleading display of corn in the Milesian marketplace. The accession of Histiaeus seems to have synchronized with a revival of the commercial prosperity of Miletus. Histiaeus was the friend and vassal of Darius of Persia, and the basis of his power must therefore not be sought exclusively in the internal conditions of Miletus. But, on the other hand, the Persians seem to have been remarkably free from any tendency to Persianize the nations they subdued. Their sins were those rather of Abdul-Hamid than of the Young Turks. Purely internal conditions continued to operate much as before. In the absence, therefore, of all evidence as to how Histiaeus came by his power, it becomes interesting to see how he sought to expand it. The chance came to him when he had won Darius' confidence and gratitude in his Scythian campaign, and the great king invited him to choose his reward. He asked for Maecenas in Edonia, wishing to found in it a city. Darius granted his request, and the foundation was begun. But when the news of this gift reached Megabazus, the able Persian officer who had reduced Edonia and other parts of Thrace and Macedonia, he was much alarmed and remonstrated with his master. "O king, what manner of thing hast thou done, granting to a clever and cunning Greek to acquire a city in Thrace, where there is an inexhaustible supply of timber for building ships and oars, and mines of silver, and a large population of Greeks living in the neighborhood, and a large population of barbarians? If they get a patron, they will do what he directs day and night. Now therefore do thou stop him from doing this, that thou be not involved in a war against thine own." As pointed out by Grundy, Maecenas occupied a most important site on great strategic and commercial highways. But there is no reason to suspect Herodotus when he tells us that the town owed its importance first and foremost not to its geographical situation but to its minerals and forests. It is as a great mine owner and shipbuilder, and the employer of hosts of miners and shipbuilders and seamen, that Histiaeus threatens to make himself a ruler sufficiently powerful to be a danger to the great king himself. The earliest tyrant of Ephesus appears to have been Pythagoras, who overthrew the government of the Basilidae. Platon of Sinope, who wrote a history of the tyrants of Ephesus, states that Pythagoras lived before Cyrus the Persian. This seems to be rather an understatement of the tyrant's antiquity, since we hear of two other tyrants, Melas and Pindarus, of whom the latter was son and successor of the former, and was deprived of his throne by Croesus, and of yet another pair, by name Athenagoras and Comas, who lived at the same time as the poet Hipponax and must therefore be assigned to about the middle of the 6th century. While during part of the reign of Croesus, after the fall of Pindarus, Ephesus appears to have enjoyed a moderate democracy guided by the Essenites Aristarchus. All this leaves little room for Pythagoras in the period just preceding Cyrus, and since too the Basilidae were almost certainly one of the hereditary aristocracies, like the Bacchiadae of Corinth, that overthrew the hereditary monarchy in most Greek cities before the end of the Dark Ages. It becomes probable that Pythagoras flourished at the beginning of the 6th century, or possibly even in the 7th. According to our only authority Suidas, who quotes Platon on the date of Pythagoras and very possibly used him for the rest of his notice, Pythagoras displayed an insatiable passion for money and showed himself a cruel tyrant, but with the people and the multitude he both was and appeared to be well liked, sometimes making them hopeful by his promises, sometimes secretly distributing small gratuities. Those, however, who enjoyed reputation or power he plundered and subjected to confiscations. Suidas deals only with the tyrant on the throne and draws plainly from a most unfriendly source, but as far as he goes he suggests that the power of Pythagoras was based on wealth. The tyrant Pandarus, who was overthrown by Croesus, was a grandson of Aliates, Croesus' father and predecessor. Ephesus was one of the chief termini of the great caravan route from the far east that ran to Sardis and then branched to several places on the coast. In the chapter on Lydia we have had occasion to notice the story of the 8th century Lydian Argos, who when banished from his native land went into business at Syme, another of these branch termini, and from there returned as ruler to Sardis. Radit may therefore be right in thinking that the Ephesian tyrants shared with the Lydian the monopoly of the trade that traversed this great road. The overthrow of Pindarus is perhaps to be associated with the story of the financial dealings of Croesus while his father Aliates was still on the throne. To pave the way to his own succession, as against his half-brother, the half-Greek Pantalon, Croesus has to borrow large sums of money. He first tries in Sardis, and failing there proceeds to Ephesus, where he succeeds in raising money, not however from the house of Melas, but from a certain Pamphis, the son of Theocharides. It is hardly rash to assume that the tyrant family at Ephesus were putting their money on the half-Greek candidate, and that Pandarus fell because his family had taken the wrong side in this great battle of high finance. Panatios of Leontini was the first in Sicily to seize the tyranny. Panatios Primus in Sicilia a repuit tyrannidum, which he is stated to have done a few years before the end of the 7th century. The stratagem by which he made himself tyrant is described by Paulinus. The people of Leontini were at war with Megara, and Panatios was polemarch. The actual coup was a matter of disarming the rich citizens who served on horseback, which he did with the help of their grooms. But before carrying out this coup d'état, Panatios had started a conflict between these rich knights and the poor who served on foot. Aristotle adds little. He classes Panatios with Cypselus in Corinth, Pisistratus in Athens, and Dionysius in Syracuse, and others who in the same way became tyrants from demagogy, a view that has already been dealt with. His other statement, that the government of Panatios succeeded an oligarchy, is credible but unilluminating. Phalaris of Agrigentum, a tax collector, When the citizens wished to erect a temple of Zeus Polius for 200 talents on the citadel, as being rocky and strong, and for the further reason that it would be pious to give the god the highest place, undertook, if he was given charge of the work, to have the best craftsmen and provide the material cheaply and offer sound securities for the money. The people trusted him, thinking that thanks to his life as a tax collector he had experience of such proceedings. So taking the public money he hired many foreigners and bought many prisoners, and carried up to the citadel much material of stone, timber, iron, and when the foundations were already being dug, he sent down his herald to proclaim whoever gives information against those who stole the stone and iron on the citadel shall receive such and such a reward. The people were annoyed at the report of the material being stolen. "Well then," said he, "allow me to enclose the Acropolis." The city allowed him to enclose it and to raise a wall round it. He released the prisoners, armed them with the stones and hatchets and axes made in attack during the Thesmophoria, killed most of the men, and having established himself as master of women and children, became the tyrant of the city of Agrigentum. For over 2 centuries the name of Phalaris has been chiefly associated with the famous controversy between the Cambridge Bentley and the Oxford Boyle as to the authenticity of the letters ascribed to him. The spuriousness of these letters was so convincingly established by the Cambridge scholar that everyone since then seems to have shrunk from attributing historical value to anything whatsoever that Phalaris is reported to have done. It so happens that the best-known tradition about Phalaris tells of his extreme cruelty, and more particularly how he did his victims to death by roasting them alive in a brazen bull. This bull story has no doubt helped further to discredit Phalaris as a strictly historical character. Yet, there can be no dispute that Phalaris did make himself tyrant of Agrigentum, and that his cruelty made a lasting impression on the people whom he ruled. His existence and importance is shown by a whole series of references to him that begins with Pindar and includes allusions in Aristotle. Considering that the tyrant probably died only 1 generation before Pindar was born, there is no reason why a trustworthy tradition about him should not have been preserved, and more particularly why the account of his early days in Polyaenus should not have a historical basis. If it has, its significance is important. It means that Phalaris owed his tyranny in the ultimate instance to his skill in finance, and more immediately to the control of large sums of money that gave him great influence over the lower classes who earned their living by manual labor. Polyaenus cannot be decisively confirmed, but still less can he be decisively discredited. The story itself suggests that its source was the temple of Zeus Polius, and a temple founded in the 6th century may well have kept some record, oral or written, of the days of its foundation. There is of course the possibility of forgery, but forgeries generally have some motive, such as gain or glory or love of the sensational. No such motive can easily be imputed to this narrative of Polyaenus, whose picture of Phalaris is borne out by notices in various other writers. Lucian, for instance, makes the tyrant a great builder and great financier and a great patron of the common people. Lucian's Phalaris is represented as defending himself at Delphi against the charge of cruelty. He certainly utters many paradoxes in so doing. But the point of the picture is that it is based on the received tradition, and it may fairly be used as evidence on a question, such as that which is being here considered. Aristotle classes Phalaris among the tyrants who owed their position to some high office that they had previously held, a statement which is good evidence for Phalaris as a historical personage, and as far as it goes accords with Polyaenus. When the Agrigentines were rid of Phalaris, they decreed that nobody should wear a blue-gray cloak, for the servants of the tyrant wore aprons of blue-gray. The prohibition of these blue-gray aprons makes it look as if the men who overthrew the tyranny of Phalaris thought it necessary to disband his army of uniformed employees. Further, the part of the narrative of Polyaenus that most concerns us here can claim a certain probability from what is known of an early namesake and fellow townsman of the Syracusan tyrant Agathocals. According to Diodorus, this earlier Agathocals, who lived while Syracuse was still under a landed aristocracy called, probably about 700 before Christ, being chosen to have charge of the building of the temple of Athena, picked out the finest of the stones that were being quarried and met the expense out of his own pocket, but misused the stones and built a costly house. At this they say the divine power gave forth a sign. Agathocles was struck by lightning and consumed by fire along with all his house. The geomoroi confiscated his property to the state, although the kleronomoi, the financial officials, showed that he had taken nothing of the moneys of the temple or of the state. They devoted his house to the gods and forbade those who came there to set foot in it, and to this day it is called the Embrontean Eye. The place struck by lightning. The positions of Phalaris and Agathocles, as described by Polyaenus and Diodorus, are very similar. Both are in charge of the building of a great temple, the Greek word in each case being, which means literally superintendent, but is rather a vague term, and appears to include the idea of contractor. Both again misuse their position, and in neither case is the offender charged with misappropriation. Phalaris secures himself a tyranny, Agathocles builds himself a house. But the house is a very special sort of house, and though the builder is specifically acquitted of any dishonest dealings about it, it brings down on him the wrath both of the gods and of the government. The gods burn him and his house. The government confiscate his property. What sort of a house was it that had such disastrous consequences for its builder? A close parallel is offered by the history of the Roman Maelius, who is said in the 5th century before Christ to have had his house pulled down and his property confiscated. In the case of Agathocles, the gods, when they destroyed his house, are said to send a sign. In that of Maelius, the offense that caused his house to be demolished is pronounced to be not a cellus but a monstrum. The charge that brought down on Maelius these extreme penalties was that of aiming at the throne. Maelius was extremely rich, and had a large army of clients, and we may reasonably infer that his house was so severely dealt with because it looked too much like a royal palace. Considering the analogies in the story of Agathocles with that of Maelius on the one hand, and that of Phalaris on the other, it looks not unlikely that the exception taken to the house of Agathocles was due to its palatial character. Private dwellings in early Greek cities were notoriously simple and unpretentious. A house in which it was possible to employ stones intended for a great temple was obviously quite the reverse. It would challenge comparison with the government buildings, and might be used as the rallying place for an armed attack upon the government. And it was this in all probability that brought on it so terrible a fate. The stories of Agathocals and Malleus lend support to the view that Polyaenus, in his account of the rise of Phalaris, is describing the normal way in which tyrannies were established at this early period in Sicily and Italy. If so, the normal tyrant in early Sicily and Italy was some very rich man who used his riches to secure financial control of some large section of the laboring classes, and this control was sometimes secured by undertaking big building operations which provided not only continuous work for numerous employees, but often too a strong and imposing headquarters that could soon be converted into the castle or palace from which he ruled the whole state. Aristodmus of Cumae is dated by the fact that he gave shelter to Tarquinius Superbus when banished from Rome. In those days Cumae was renowned throughout Italy for its wealth and power. Before he became tyrant, he is said to have distinguished himself as a soldier. But it was not as a soldier that he is represented as securing the tyranny. He won over the people by turning demagogue, relieving many of the poor out of his own purse, distributing money to them man by man, and depositing for the common good the presents he had received from the people of Aricia. At the end of his reign he is represented as employing citizens on a large scale on manual labor. He chanced about that time to be making a trench round the place, a work neither necessary nor useful, but merely because he wished to weary and exhaust the citizens with toils and labors. For each was ordered to remove a certain extent of earth. The chronology of the tyrant's career is not altogether easy, and the narrative not entirely credible, but we appear to have a tyrant of the early type, taking a prominent part in war and politics, but relying largely, at any rate, on the control of labor and the power of wealth. Chapter X. Capitalist despots of the age of Aristotle. Be the money power of the rulers of Pergamum. See Protogenes of Olbia. Stress has been laid on the influence that has been exercised by Dionysius of Syracuse upon all who have written about the early tyranny since he came to power. This, of course, does not mean that the military demagogue type of tyrant, of which Dionysius is the supreme example, was never at all anticipated in any of its features by any of the rulers of the 7th and 6th centuries. Nor does it mean that the new order of things that culminated in Dionysius completely swamped the old. Aristotle himself was personally connected with a tyrant who appears to illustrate the survival into the 4th century of the 7th and 6th century type. The ruler in question, Hermias, tyrant of Assos and Atarneus, was a eunuch, the slave of a certain banker. He went to Athens and attended the lectures of Plato and Aristotle. And returning, he shared the tyranny of his master, who had previously secured the places round Atarneus and Assos. Subsequently he succeeded him and sent for Aristotle and married his niece to him. In this slave, banker, philosopher, and despot Leaf sees a tyrant who owed his position to his wealth. He quotes Euaeon, the pupil of Plato, who not far off to the north at Lampsacus lent money to the city on the security of the Acropolis. And, when the city defaulted, wanted to become tyrant, until the Lampsacines gathered against him, and after paying him the money cast him out. On the other side of Assos, at Syme, the public porticos once passed into the hands of some bankers who had lent money to the city on that security. Leaf might have gone on to quote the case of Timaeus the Cyzicene, who, like Euaeon and perhaps Hermias, had been a pupil of Plato, Timaeus the Cyzicene having granted bonuses of money and corn to the citizens, and having on that account won credit among the Cyzicenes as being a worthy man, after a short while made an attempt on the city, cp. above of the predecessor of Hermias by means of Arrhidaeus. The attempt failed, but there can be no doubt that Timaeus, like Euaeon, wanted to become tyrant by means of his wealth. It is curious to notice that the method of securing power practiced by the pupils of Plato and Aristotle is precisely that which was prescribed by our own Dr. Johnson. No, sir, the way to make sure of power and influence is by lending money confidentially to your neighbors at a small interest, or perhaps at no interest at all, and having their bonds in your possession. In Aristotle's own day it appears to have been followed, though without success. In the greatest commercial city of the age, after this Anno, a man of Carthage, who in personal wealth was more than a match for the state, was absorbed with a desire to seize supreme power. He stirred up the slaves that with their aid he might suddenly crush the unsuspecting state. This happened in the days of Philip. Thus there is a basis for Leaf's suggestion that Eubulos of Assos, the master and predecessor of Hermias, had made himself tyrant by similar means. But if Aristotle had before him the career of Hanno the Carthaginian, and if a whole group of his own fellow students made the attempt, and in one case at least successfully, to become financier despots in a corner of the world particularly familiar to the philosopher, how are we to explain the fact that his writings take no account of the commercial tyrant? Once more, if I am not mistaken, the cause is largely Dionysius. If, as seems probable, there was this late outcrop of attempts at a commercial tyranny, none the less the type had long ceased to play any great part in history. Hanno was a failure. Moreover, he tampered with the slaves of Carthage, and this enabled Aristotle to classify him with Pausanias the Spartan. For Aristotle, the tyrant is a soldier or a demagogue, or both. Plutocracy with him means oligarchy, as he himself says, if one individual possesses more than the rest of the wealthy. On the oligarchic principle, it is right that he should rule alone. If forced to catalogue the government of a commercial despot, he would probably have described it as an oligarchy of one. But it is doubtful whether the government of Hermias was strictly speaking the rule of a single individual. An inscription now in the British Museum speaks repeatedly of which Leaf translates and explains into Hermias and Company. Bankers and despots. The precise nature of these companions is uncertain, but their repeated mention in a treaty suggests that Hermias tried to avoid the appearances of single rule. Lastly, the personal element may have had its influence even with the great philosopher. Not only was he in close personal connection with Hermias, but his one deviation into poetry, his remarkable ode to virtue, was written in honor of Hermias after his fall. According to one version of the story, the philosopher's devotion to the memory of his friend cost him his life. Plainly, for Aristotle, the ruler of Tarquinius was no tyrant, and it follows that Euaeon and Timaeus, even if their efforts had been successful, would not have been so either. Plato, on the other hand, would have particular cause to regard as a tyrant the Syracusan ruler by whom he is said to have been sold into slavery for 20 minae. In short, this group of would-be philosopher kings probably did as much as Dionysius himself to blind Aristotle and later writers to the true nature of 7th and 6th century tyranny. If Aristotle had lived another 40 years, he might have witnessed quite near Tarquinius the rise of another and much more notable monarchy, that of the Italics of Pergamum, which was also based almost exclusively on wealth. Pergamum had become the fortified treasury of Lysimachus when he succeeded to the Thracian dominions of Alexander the Great. The keeping of the fort and the 9,000 talents of treasure that it contained was entrusted to a certain Phalaris. He was a eunuch, but well brought up, and he showed himself worthy of the trust. In spite of, or rather perhaps as the result of, the quarrels of the Diadochoi, he continued for 20 years master of the fort and of the money. There seems little doubt that Phalaris was of humble birth, and that he owed his rise to this gift of finance, which secured him first the management and then the possession of these 9,000 talents. He began his independent career by going over from Lysimachus, whose realm lay mainly in Europe, to Seleucus, the most able of the Diadochoi in Asia. Shortly afterwards, Seleucus was murdered by Ptolemy Koronos, the Greek king of Egypt. But Phalaris, who believed firmly in the fortunes of the Seleucids, secured the friendship of Antiochus, the son and successor of Seleucus, by buying the body of the murdered king at a heavy price from Koronos and sending it to Antiochus. Phalaris was always ready to draw upon his 9,000 talents, if by doing so he could purchase power. When the people of the neighboring town of Pitane were in debt to the extent of 380 talents, Phalaris advanced a portion of that sum, and thereby secured influence over that city. Gifts were made to Cyzicus with similar intentions and results. The island of Aegina became a Pergamene possession for the price of 30 talents. These proceedings are typical of the way in which the rulers of Pergamum established and maintained their position. As Home observes, their power was a money power, like every other political power that has hitherto arisen. That of the Italics was partly military, soon after the death of Phalaris and the accession of Attalus, the second ruler of the dynasty. Asia Minor was overrun by the Celtic hordes, which finally settled down to a peaceful life in what was known thenceforth as Galatia. The promiscuous maraudings of these barbarians were checked and eventually crushed by Attalus and his successors. But the Attalids were still more notable for their works of peace. Under their government, Pergamum became one of the most active centers of art and industry in the whole world. The city, elaborately constructed in terraces on a lofty hillside, offered a remarkably successful example of scientific town planning, and must have involved a large and highly organized army of architects, builders, masons, and the like. The Pergamene school of sculpture flourished exceedingly. We owe to it Lord Byron's Dying Gladiator, who has long since been recognized as a copy of a dying Galatian carved at Pergamum to commemorate a victory of Attalus I over the Celtic invader. Much of Pergamene art is exaggerated and ugly, but that does not diminish its economic significance, and Mommsen is justified in describing Attalus I as the Lorenzo de Medici of antiquity. We have already compared the Medici with the early Greek tyrants. But it is not merely that the Pergamene rulers and early tyrants like Gyges have a common resemblance, the Italian merchant princes of the early Renaissance. A distinct resemblance between the Attalids and the house of Gyges has been already recognized and developed by Adolf Home. The two powers are much the same geographically. Both are the great connecting link between the Greek Aegean and the Asiatic lands that lie to the east of it. Both organize the forces of material prosperity against barbaric invasions from the north. Both have money as the basis of their power. The history of Phalaris and his successors at Pergamum increases the probability that Leif is right in his picture of the banker despots of the days of Plato and Aristotle. The picture is scarcely complete enough to be quite convincing, but it may be supplemented and confirmed from the history of a financial magnate named Protogenes, who flourished at Albia probably towards the end of the 3rd century before Christ. Protogenes is known only from a single inscription put up during his lifetime to record his benefactions to his native city. The date of the inscription is not quite certain. The lettering points to the 2nd century before Christ but does not exclude a rather earlier date, and a reference in the inscription to danger threatening Olbia from certain Galatians rather favors a date before 213 before Christ. Within the space of 3 years, Protogenes made gifts to his city amounting to 12,700 gold pieces, and made up of the following items. 4 times he contributes to help buy off the barbarians who at this period were constantly threatening the city. Twice he pays for repairs to the city walls. He built or repaired the public granary, the bazaar gateway, and the barges that brought the stone for these building operations. He redeemed for 100 pieces of gold the city plate, which was about to be put in the melting pot by one of the city's creditors. He pays down 300 pieces of gold for wine which the city fathers had purchased and then found that they could not pay for. He contributes directly or indirectly to the purchase of large quantities of corn for the city. He remits to the amount of 6,000 gold pieces, i.e. nearly half his total benefaction, private debts owed to himself or his father. During the 3 years covered by these gifts, Protogenes was financial director of the city's affairs, a position which he had reached after a wide experience of public business. To see in this financial direction of the city's affairs an instance of a commercial tyranny would be a pure hypothesis. It is not even certain that Protogenes made all his gifts quite voluntarily. One of his contributions for the purchase of corn was made after the demos had passed a resolution that the wealthy ought to advance money for this purpose. On one of the occasions when he paid for repairs to the town walls, he did so at the invitation of the people. Advance and invitation may be euphemisms for tax-paying and compulsion, and the payments made by proto-genes may have had affinity to the liturgies paid to the state by rich Athenians in the 5th century rather than to the benevolences that Lucius Tarquinius is said to have paid voluntarily for his own ends to the people of Rome. This latter hypothesis is not better founded than the other. Advance and request may after all mean what they say. We do not know what became of Proto-Genes after his 3 years as financial director. The financial directorship may correspond to the magistracy that is said to have frequently led directly to the tyranny, e.g. at Corinth and Miletus. Proto-Genes is of course much later in date, but the Greek cities of South Russia were the home of many curious survivals. At Olbia itself, for instance, we find a style of pottery that in Greece proper was typical of the 5th and 4th centuries, persisting apparently into the 1st. There are even hints that Olbia had once at least, and perhaps comparatively recently, gone through a social and economic revolution something like those that so often convulsed the cities of the 7th and 6th centuries just before they fell under tyrants, e.g. Athens before the tyranny of Pisistratus, or Miletus before that of Histiaeus. While the city was being besieged by a certain Superior, the Olbiopolitans had set slaves free, given foreigners citizenship, and cancelled all debts. If this Superior is the governor left by Alexander in Thrace, this revolution must be dated at least a century earlier than Proto-Genes. If with Grote we refuse to accept this identification, the revolution is left dateless. In any case, it shows that such upheavals did happen in Olbia, and serves to remind us how very incomplete is the material with which we are dealing. But the value for our inquiry of the Proto-Genes inscription does not depend on any speculations of this kind. What it does is to give us a detailed picture of an exceptionally wealthy man in an ancient Greek city-state, who for a considerable period largely financed his city. If Proto-Genes could do this in Olbia, there can be nothing inherently improbable in the hypothesis that other great capitalists had done something similar in other cities. If Proto-Genes did not turn his position into a political tyranny, that would be no proof that others did not do so, and the fact remains that the assumption that Proto-Genes was not on the way to become a tyrant, or indeed that he did not actually become one, if not precisely wild, is purely hypothetical. The records of Proto-Genes illustrate the sort of way in which the financial magnate might win the supreme place in his city. The whole group of facts associated with his name, and with those of Eubulos, Hermias, Euaeon, Timaeus, Phalaris, and Attalus, shows once again that at least there is nothing improbable in the theory that the power of the 7th and 6th century tyrants was built up on a similar financial or industrial basis. The more so considering the evidence adduced already for believing that conditions in the earlier period were uniquely favorable for the establishment of a money power. We have seen why the financial despots of the age of Plato and Aristotle should not have helped to preserve the memory of earlier money powers. It is no less easy to see why the same should have been the case with the rulers of Pergamum An exceptional circumstance saved the house of Phalaris from being reproached with its mercenary basis. And curiously enough, that circumstance was one which illustrates how very mercenary that basis was. When Attalus Roman III, the last of his house, died in 133 before Christ, he made the Roman people his heirs. His fortune was used by the Gracchan revolutionaries to equip the impoverished Romans whom they were restoring to the land by their agrarian laws. The dynasty, too, with its clear eye for the main chance, had always consistently sought the friendship of Rome. Though most of our authorities for the history of the Attalids are Greek, the Greeks in question were all pro-Roman, with the result that we see the Attalids essentially from the Roman point of view. They stood in much the same relationship to the Romans as the house of Gyges did to the Greeks. And the Romans, to whom Attalus Roman III had left all his treasure and possessions, were as little inclined to think harshly of their benefactor as were the Greeks whom Croesus had so largely benefited inclined to be critical of his hospitable virtue. In both cases the man of business was known only as the patron of deserving charities. We have to go to rulers like the Tarquins and Pisistratids, whose history we owe ultimately to their own subjects and employees, to hear the money power described as it really was and given its true name of tyranny. Chapter Roman 11, Conclusion, Plato, Laws, v. 743a. We adopted a law that if you bought an office you didn't get it. I admit that that is contrary to all commercial principles, but I think it is pretty good political doctrine. Woodrow Wilson. This final chapter will contain are some of the evidence already adduced. Be a short general discussion of the credibility of the whole mass of extant evidence, and C, an attempt to view in their proper perspective the conclusions that the evidence seems to warrant. Are some of previous chapters. The age of the first known metal coins is also the age of the first rulers to be called tyrants. Ancient evidence and modern analogy both suggest that the new form of government was based on the new form of capital. The modern analogy is to be found in the financial revolution, which has largely replaced metal coins by paper, thereby rendering capital very much more mobile. Just as was done by the financial revolution of the age of the tyrants and has led many people to fear a new tyranny of wealth. The ancient evidence is to be found in the scanty extant writings of the 6th century before Christ, Solon and Theognis, in scattered notices about early tyrants or tyranny in 5th century writers Thucydides, Herodotus, Pindar, in certain statements of Aristotle, in references to industrial conditions both during and after the age of the tyrants, in the history of the states where there was never a tyranny, and in the steps taken to prevent a recurrence of tyranny. If the commercial origin of the early tyranny is not explicitly formulated by any ancient writer, it should be remembered how meager are contemporary documents, and how little Greek writers say about economic causes. It is true also that my view is at variance with statements of Plato, Aristotle, and subsequent writers, but their picture of the rise of tyranny clashes with known facts about the 7th and 6th centuries, and is due to false generalizations from the conditions of their own days and particularly from the career of Dionysius of Syracuse. Pisistratus made himself tyrant by organizing the Attic hill men diakrioi epikrioi against the two previously existing rival factions of the plain and the coast. The accepted explanations of these hill men are improbable. They cannot have been farmers or shepherds, who were always very conservative, are not recorded as having subsequently supported Pisistratus, and must have lived principally in the plain and very little in the forest-clad mountains, where modern theories generally locate them. Nor were the hill men confined to the mountainous district of North Attica, the mistaken identification of which with the hill country is due to mistaken views as to the triple division of Attica into hill, coast, and plain, which wrongly assigns all South Attica to the coast and limits the coast to South Attica. These views on the triple division of Attica in the days of Pisistratus are based on the weakest of evidence and are made improbable by the subsequent topographical arrangements of Cleisthenes 502 before Christ, and by the later uses of the terms Diacria and Epacria. The Epacria contained a village named Semachidai which, as shown by a recently found inscription, lay in the hilly mining district of South Attica. Furthermore, the Attic Akron par excellence was Cape Sunium, the southern apex of the Attic mining district, and of the whole Attic peninsula. In view of these facts, it becomes probable that the Sunium and Laurium mining district was the hill country par excellence. The mines were almost certainly in full work at this period, and the miners, unlike those of later ages, free men, good material for a political faction. That Pisistratus based his power on silver mines is made very likely by what is known of his subsequent career. He finally rooted his power on money derived partly from home, partly from the Thracian mining district. He went to the Thracian mining district to prepare for his second restoration. His first restoration is attributed to the dressing up as Athena of a Thracian woman named Phi, who is very possibly to be explained away as the Athena who begins about this time to appear on Attic coins. For this interpretation of the Phi story, compare the names girl, virgin, Pallas colloquially given to the Attic coins, and the jest about Agesilaus being driven out of Asia by the great king's archers, a colloquial name for Persian gold coins. The tyranny fell at Athens when the tyrants lost control of the Thracian mining district. Shortly afterwards, the ambitious Histiaeus, the Greek friend of the Persian king into whose power the mines had passed, incurred the suspicions of the Persian sovereign through attempting to build up a political power on these very mines and miners. The history of the Alcmeonid opposition to the house of Pisistratus likewise suggests that the government of Athens at this period depended first and foremost on the power of the purse. Polycrates is perhaps best known for his piracies, but it seems not unlikely that these piracies were in fact an elaborate commercial blockade of Persia that proved almost as unpopular among Greek neutrals as among the subjects of the great king against whom it was mainly directed. As tyrant Polycrates is found controlling the commercial and industrial activities of his state, building ships, harbor works and waterworks, and very possibly a great bazaar, and probably employing much free labor on these works. Before he became tyrant, he already had an interest in the chief Samian industries, the working of metal and the manufacture of woolen goods. Aias, the father of Polycrates, is probably the Aias whom a recently discovered Samian inscription appears to connect with the sea-borne trade of the island. The tyrant is said to have owed his fall to an attempt to get money enough to rule all Greece, a statement of particular value considering the tendency to administer poetic justice that is so frequently displayed by Herodotus. Who is our authority for this statement? The great developments of trade and industry that just preceded the age of tyranny in Greece had their parallel, if not their origin, in Egypt. At the height of this development in Egypt, a new and powerful dynasty arises which bases its power on commerce and on the commercial and industrial classes. Already towards the end of the 8th century we find King Pacorus, somewhat after the manner of the Argive Phaedon, devoting special attention to commercial legislation. His successor Sethon is said by Herodotus to have based his power on hucksters and artisans and tradespeople. During these reigns the country was always being occupied or threatened by foreign invaders from Ethiopia or Assyria. The first Egyptian king of this period to rule all Egypt in normal conditions of peace and quietness was Psammetichus I, who rose to power about the same time as Cypselus in Corinth and Orthogoras in Sicyon. Psammetichus, according to Diodorus, converted his position from that of a petty Delta chieftain, one of 12 who shared the rule of the part of the country not in foreign occupation, into that of supreme ruler of the whole country, as a result of the wealth and influence that he won by trading with Phoenicians and Greeks. This last statement, if true, establishes Psammetichus as a commercial tyrant. It occurs only in Diodorus, and receives no direct confirmation in earlier writers, but it is in entire harmony with all that is known about events and conditions in Egypt at this period, and more particularly with the notices just quoted as to Pacorus and Sethon, with the history of Amasis and the other later sates as recorded in Herodotus, and with the conclusions to be drawn from the excavation of Naucratis and the other Greek settlements that played so important a part in Sate Egypt. From the middle of the 8th century before Christ till the early part of the 5th, Lydia appears to have been a power in which the ruler based his position on wealth, and struggles for the throne were fought with the weapons of trade and finance. This, according to the accounts, is the case with Spermos and Ardes in the 8th century, and with Croesus in the 6th. The story of Gyges and his magic ring may also be explained in the same sense. A similar state of things is indicated in the advice which Croesus is made by Herodotus to give to Cyrus. In the story of the revolt of Pactyes, and in that of Xerxes and the rich Pides, at about the time to which we can trace back this state of things in Lydia, two events were taking place that are both attributed to Lydia, namely the striking of the first metal coins and the appearance of the first tyrant. In neither case are the dates very precise. The first coins are more probably to be placed late in the 8th century than early in the 7th. And though Gyges is stated to have been the first tyrant, there are reasons for suspecting that he may have been merely the first ruler of his kind to attract the attention of the Greeks. The magic ring, too, by which he secured his tyranny is sometimes attributed not to Gyges, but to some not very remote ancestor of his, or to the 8th century plutocrat Miletus, king of the neighboring Phrygia. But on any showing the ring falls within the limits of time and place to which may be ascribed the earliest coins and the earliest tyrant. Rings are one common form of early currency, and it is not impossible that it was to the ring in this sense that the first tyrant owed his tyranny. This view, which implies that the earliest coins were private issues, and that the coinage was only nationalized when the principal coiner became chief of the state, is supported alike by evidence and analogies. Phaedon, who was probably the first ruler to be called tyrant in European Greece, is described by Herodotus as the man who created for the Peloponnesians their measures, a description that at once suggests that it was this commercial step that differentiated Phaedon the tyrant from the kings who preceded him. Later writers, of whom the earliest is Ephorus, go further and state that silver was first coined by Phaedon in Aegina. The statement has been called in question, but it is confirmed by the chapters of Herodotus v. 82f, which describe the early relations between Argos, Aegina, and Athens. In the light of recent archaeological inquiries, it becomes highly probable that Argos became predominant in Aegina as described in these chapters of Herodotus, which are unfortunately most vague in their chronology just about the time when Phaedon most probably reigned. And this probability is increased by the tradition that Phaedon recovered the lot of Temenos, the domain of the kings of Argos in early Dorian times, which included the island of Aegina. The occupation of Aegina by Argos, which we have seen reason to associate with Phaedon, gave rise, according to Herodotus, to a change in the measures which probably included the weights system in use on the island, the new measures being half as great again as those previously in use. The Aeginetan standard on which the Aeginetan coins were struck is roughly half as great again as the other and probably earlier standard used in ancient Greece. The statement of Ephorus that silver was first coined by Phaedon in Aegina is thus strikingly confirmed, which means that the first ruler to strike coins in European Greece was also the first to be called tyrant. The tyranny at Corinth coincides with the great industrial and commercial developments of the city described by Thucydides I. 13 in words that are a paraphrase of his description of the state of things that led to the rise of tyrannies in Greece generally. Scholars agree that the tyrants had a direct interest in some of these developments, notably shipping, colonizing, and coinage. The main industry of Corinth at this period seems to have been pottery, with which she supplied much of the Greek world. Of the early career of the first tyrant, Cypselus, very little is known beyond the story in Herodotus which professes to explain how the infant Cypselus got his curious name. We have examined in some detail the meaning of the words Cypselus and Cypsel, and found that they probably mean potter and pot. So that the man who established the tyranny at Corinth seems to have borne a name that associates him with the main industry of his city. Both in date and in character, the corresponding period at Rome to the age of the tyrants in Greece is that which is occupied by the reigns of the Tarquins. The first king of this dynasty, Tarquinius Priscus, is said to have been the son of a rich Corinthian named Demaratus. Early in life, the first of the Tarquins had settled in Rome. It was by means of his wealth that he secured the throne. Both he and his father are said to have been great employers of labor, and the accounts imply that their employees were free men. Servius Tullius, who succeeded Tarquinius Priscus, is said to have been the first at Rome to strike coins and to have secured the support of the poor by gifts and benevolences. When the last of the Tarquins, Tarquinius Superbus, overthrew Servius Tullius and secured the throne, he did so by buying up the poorest of the common people. After his succession, he is described as employing Etruscans and Roman citizens on a large scale as artisans and quarrymen. He loses the throne when he can no longer pay these employees. During the first century of the Republic, the established government several times thought itself threatened with attempts to restore the kingship. In each case, it is the wealth or the exceptional financial position of the suspected person that causes the alarm. Early Republican statesmen are repeatedly reported as charging the Tarquins with having degraded Roman citizens from their natural position as soldiers and gentlemen into tradesmen and artisans, a charge which implies the reverse change as having accompanied the change from kingly government to republican. The final blow to the monarchist movement at Rome seems to have been dealt when army pay was instituted, and the government as paymaster of the army became the greatest employer of paid free labor in the state. One later attempt to establish a tyranny at Rome has been suspected by Mommsen. The man he suspects of it is Appius Claudius Caecus, the censor of 312 before Christ. Appius was noted for the number of his clients and the great public works that he conducted, and he probably had a close connection with the first real coinage struck by Rome. Attention has also been drawn to the accounts of the secessions, with their curious resemblances to modern strikes and their implication of organization on the part of labor. At Ardea in North Latium, about the year 440 before Christ, the working classes are described as playing a decisive part in the struggle for supreme power. At VIII in the year 400 before Christ, we are told of a rich employer who became king of his city. The statements just quoted have all been often regarded with extreme skepticism. The reasons for this skepticism have been examined in the chapter on Rome. It is impossible to resume them here. If my conclusions are not entirely wrong, the skepticism of the last century represented an excessive reaction against the undue credulity of earlier ages. Recent archaeological discoveries enormously increase the probability of the narrative in its main outlines. But if after all the skeptics are right on this particular question, and the Tarquin narrative is a fiction, it is none the less of historical value, and confirms the view that the early tyrannies was commercial. Since if fiction, it must be an early Greek fiction, preserving an early Greek conception of the typical early tyrant as a great capitalist. In chapter Roman 9, we surveyed the evidence for the origin of the early tyrannies at Sicyon, Megara, Miletus, Ephesus, Leontini, Agrigentum, and Cumae. The material is scanty, and it is enough here to recall that as far as it goes it supports the theory of a commercial origin. At Sicyon, the tyranny is founded by a tradesman, the son of a tradesman. At Megara, Thegenes rises to power as the result of what looks very like the creation of a corner in the staple product of his city. At Miletus and Leontini we find tyrants arising as the result of something like class war between rich and poor. while a later tyrant of Miletus tries to establish a great political position by getting control of the mines and miners of Thrace. At Ephesus and Cumae, the tyrant's power is said to be based on the money that they distributed among the poorer classes. While at Agrigentum the tyrant is definitely stated to have secured the tyranny through his position as a great employer. In the times of Aristotle there are several cases in the Pergamene district of rich bankers and the like making attempts, of which one at least was successful, to secure supreme political power in their cities by means of their wealth. The close personal relationship in which Aristotle stood to some of them partly explains why they are not classed by him as tyrants. Not long afterwards, the far more important power of the rulers of Pergamum owed its origin entirely to the enormous wealth of the founder of the dynasty. Later still at Olbia chance has preserved an inscription which records how a very rich Olbiopolitan named Protogenes became financial director of his city. Though there is no evidence that Protogenes ever became a tyrant, the inscription shows that the sort of position which we have imagined to have been normally built up by the would-be tyrant of the 7th or 6th century was actually secured some 3 or 4 centuries later by a wealthy individual in this remote and backward Greek city on the Black Sea. B. The credibility of the evidence as a whole. The value of the various items of evidence collected and reviewed in the preceding chapters varies very greatly. In some cases we have precise statements bearing closely on the point in question, and made by almost contemporary writers. At the other end of the list we have anecdotes of doubtful relevance and doubtful authenticity found in writers who lived centuries after the period to which they refer. It is difficult to sum up the value of so miscellaneous a collection. The estimate is bound to vary greatly according to the temperament and training of the person who makes it. There are, however, 2 points which seem in the present state of scholarship to need especial emphasis. The first of these refers to the generally prevalent attitude towards the question of historical truth as it affects generally the period under consideration. No one who has read at all widely in modern writings on ancient history can have failed to observe that the skepticism or credulity of any given scholar has always depended largely on that of his generation. Up to a point this is inevitable, but we are reaching a stage when it is no longer necessary to follow quite so blindly as has hitherto been done the natural reaction from excessive credulity to excessive skepticism and vice versa. The pendulum has now been swinging long enough for its motion to be observed and allowed for. There is no doubt that scholars of a few generations ago were often and perhaps in general unduly credulous. But it is no less certain that the main tendency of the past century has been to react from excessive credulity to no less excessive skepticism. The beginnings of the skeptical reaction were observed by Byron. I've stood upon Achilles' tomb and heard Troy doubted. Time will doubt of Rome. The doubts about Troy have been triumphantly dispelled by the spade. So likewise, as we have seen already, have many doubts as to the reality of the Tarquins' Rome. But the wonderful discoveries of the last 40 years at Troy, Mycenae, Knossos, Phaistos, and other sites of early Cretan civilization have diverted the attention of scholars from later periods. It need therefore cause no surprise if in the preceding pages there has repeatedly been occasion to criticize prevailing views as excessively and uncritically skeptical. The second point on the question of historical truth that I wish here to emphasize is concerned more directly with the evidence collected in this book. As already admitted, the collection contains many items of doubtful value. It could not be otherwise if it was to be at all complete. The cumulative effect of so much dubious evidence upon some mental temperaments is to discredit the mass of evidence as a whole. It is important, therefore, to bear in mind the character of our material. It is a heap, not a chain. Its strength is to be measured by its strongest items rather than by its weakest. Weak or irrelevant items do not invalidate any that are relevant and cogent. On the contrary, points of evidence that are individually unconvincing may have a powerful cumulative effect if they are found all pointing, however dimly, in one definite direction, and all suggesting a single explanation arrived at on independent grounds. When dealing with the dawn of history, it is uncritical to reject a whole body of evidence merely because it is made up of details scarcely any of which are capable of proof. The evidence of history, or at any rate of Greek history, in its childhood is like that of many an individual child. The child's idea of truth is often more fluid than that of the adult. It may be harder in any given case to be sure of the exact facts, but it may all the same be certain that facts more or less accurately recorded form a large element of the information. That, it may be fairly claimed, is how the evidence that has been presented in this volume ought to be regarded. Its cumulative value is really considerable. It should be remembered how independent our witnesses are. Livy on the Tarquins of Rome is corroborated by Diodorus on Psammaticus of Egypt. Herodotus on early tyrants generally is borne out by his critic Thucydides. The later writers who have been quoted so frequently and in such numbers drew upon a great variety of sources. Literary evidence is confirmed by archaeological. As for instance when a conjecture as to the hill men of Pisistratus that I put forward in 1906 is corroborated by an inscription that was first published just after the publication of my conjecture. When witnesses are so many, and they speak on such a variety of topics, and under such a variety of circumstances, and to all appearances without the possibility of any common cue, the chances of collusion become remote in the extreme. See conclusions. But granted that the various items of evidence that we have so far collected have all a real historical value, and granted, too, that they lend one another a considerable amount of mutual support, there is a further line of criticism that deserves a careful consideration. The evidence may all be true, and yet the inferences that have been drawn from it be false, or at least ill-balanced and misleading. Kings and tyrants have in all ages tended to be extremely rich. In most ages great riches have been indispensable for anyone aiming at great political power, and the greater the power aimed at, naturally enough the greater the riches required to secure it. Admittedly, the tyrants lived in a commercial age, and the influence of wealth was particularly strong. Does the evidence that has just been presented prove in reality very much more than that? Some of the statements about the men who became tyrants are indeed sufficiently explicit. As, for example, that about the trading of the young Samaticus, or the wealth and workmen of the young Lucius Tarquinius. But apart from the question of their trustworthiness, they are all so brief and meagre that it is impossible to be sure that we see them in the right perspective. They are not very adequate for forming any picture of the men they refer to or even of their financial position. In short, the early tyrants may have all been rich and all men of business, and yet their riches and business activities may have been neither the basis nor the distinguishing feature of their rule. They arose in a many-sided age, and there were many other developments that might have conceivably brought them to the top. The doctrine of the divine right of kings had lost its hold. The struggles between the kings and the nobles had doubtless led both parties to appeal to the people, and from that it might well be no far step to the people's appointing its own rulers. Then again, there had been a revolution in the art of war. The Homeric days were over, when the heavy-armed chieftain was everything and his followers a more or less useless rabble. In the new kind of warfare, large bodies of trained men at arms counted for everything. Such a change might easily encourage a whole series of military officers to seize the supreme power. Furthermore, in the case at any rate of the outlying Greek cities, and particularly those of Asia Minor, the constant danger from barbarian neighbors might readily suggest the appointment of a military dictator. And we do, in fact, find the early tyrants described as having been previously demagogues or soldiers. But we find also that these descriptions go back only to Aristotle, and have their source in 5th and 4th century conditions. Even if they went further back, the objection just raised against the commercial explanation applies still more strongly here. Kings and rulers who govern in fact as well as in name are generally something of public speakers or soldiers. It is almost an impossibility to find a self-raised ruler who cannot be described as either a demagogue or a polemarch. Similarly with the notices about important offices of state alleged to have been held by various tyrants before they attained to supreme power. They are indeed among the most reliable items of information that we possess about the early tyrants. But their significance can be easily overrated. If ever a merchant who was aiming at the tyranny sought to strengthen his political influence by obtaining office, the record of his magistracy would be much more likely to be preserved than that of his commercial successes. When we come to the detailed evidence as presented in the previous pages, the balance in favor of the commercial theory may be claimed as decisive. If once the commercial origin of the tyrant's power is admitted, the various facts recorded about individual tyrants certainly gain in meaning and coherence. The mercenaries, the monetary reforms and innovations, the public works, the labor legislation, the colonial policy, and the commercial alliances with foreign states, which have been repeatedly found associated with the early tyrants, and which give the preserved accounts of them such a distinct stamp, become far more significant if it is granted that the tyrant's power was based on his control of the labor and trade of his city. As has been already observed, the fact that a theory explains the connections between an obviously connected group of phenomena is no proof of its truth, but on the other hand a theory which fails to explain satisfactorily such a connection is at an obvious disadvantage as compared with one which does. That is one further reason why the typical tyrant is not to be explained as a successful soldier or demagogue whose riches came to him suddenly at the same moment as his throne. The adventurer of either of these types might indeed further the commercial developments of the city that he had seized. It would be, of course, to his interest to do so, but as a general rule the man who has secured a fortune at a single stroke does not care to improve it by years of patient and organized effort. If all or any considerable number of the tyrants reviewed above had owed their positions to their sword or their tongue, there would inevitably have been some cases of commercial retrogression under the tyrannies, whereas in fact there are none. This is a fundamental fact. The tyrants were one and all first-class businessmen. If they did not deliberately use their wealth to secure their position, there is only one other possible explanation of their history. Their financial abilities must have led their fellow countrymen to put them in the way of seizing the throne. And that is roughly the account of them that is to be found in some modern histories, where they are vaguely pictured as the more or less passive products of blind economic forces. This view seems to me untenable. It cannot be reconciled with the impression made by the early tyrants on writers like Aristotle. More fatal still, we have a series of lawgivers like Solon, who was a businessman who gained his position precisely in the way just indicated. Some of Solon's friends reproached him with his folly in not making himself tyrant. But the fact remains that no lawgiver of the period did so, and that the titles of and that were given these legally appointed dictators were never applied either by friends or enemies to any of the tyrants at any period of their careers. One fact has still to be explained. Different as are the views about tyrants and tyranny expressed by different ancient writers at different times, they have this feature in common. All alike express their hatred of tyrannical government. For Plato, the man who becomes a tyrant is changed from a man into a wolf. When Herodotus digresses into a debate on the merits of the chief forms of government, he makes the critic of tyranny declare that there is nothing more unjust than it or more bloodthirsty in the whole world. There is no judgment from heaven on the man who lays low a tyrant. This doctrine of Theognis is perpetually preached all through Greek history. Harmodius and Aristogiton, the Athenian tyrannicides, were celebrated in sculpture and in song, and their names were constantly on the lips of orators. There are apparent exceptions to this attitude. The Aristotelian Constitution of Athens, chapter Romans 16, records that the tyranny of Pisistratus was often praised as the life of the days of Cronos, i.e. as the Golden Age, and the pseudo-Platonic Hipparchus, 229b, speaks of it in similar terms. Under the tyrants the Athenians lived much as in the days when Cronos was king. But the Aristotelian version states also what it was that evoked this praise. Pisistratus always secured peace and maintained quiet. Therefore his tyranny was often praised. The phraseology of the two quotations shows that the praise was given not to the form of government, but to the peaceful life that it procured, a life that might be, and sometimes has been, associated with the most oppressive of governments. The word tyrant appears to be Lydian, and to have been first applied among the Greeks to the rulers who followed in the steps of the Lydian Gyges, whom some ancient writers describe as the first tyrant. Originally it was used in a colorless sense as a synonym for king or monarch. It is still so used in the tragedians and frequently in Herodotus. But wherever the tyrant is spoken of in contradistinction to the king, it is always in terms of detestation. It must have been something in the character of the early tyrants that first gave the word the evil connotation, which it has preserved until this day. What that something was is not easy to determine with certainty. Much of it may be mere misrepresentation. Aristotle makes a statement about the tyrants with whom he was acquainted that is generally true of all monarchies. The tyrant, he says, supports the people and the masses against the nobles. We must not forget that the extant narratives represent almost exclusively the point of view of the aristocracy. It has often been suggested that this fact may account for the almost unanimous condemnation of the tyranny. But is this explanation altogether adequate? The Greek tyrant and the Roman rex are not the only monarchs who have had a bad press. The emperors of Rome and the kings of Israel and Judah suffered likewise. Yet Jewish priests and Roman senators were not able to turn the titles of king and emperor and Caesar into a byword and reproach. There must have been some very special circumstances to account for the universal execration of the name of tyrant. Is it not perhaps to be found in the commercial character of its origin, from the days of the Zeus-born king of Homer and long before, back to the very beginnings of leadership among men? Legitimate kingship has always been held to rest upon the personal capacity of the ruler. This is the basis of belief in hereditary monarchy, or any other system that attaches great importance to birth and upbringing. It is no less the basis of much republicanism, which from one point of view is merely a denial of the value of heredity and specialized political education. Men have often been ready, and with reason, to endure much from a ruler whose power is based on his personality. But there is one basis of political power that mankind has never tolerated, and that basis is mere riches. They have felt with Plato that the plutocrat as such has no right at all to rule. He seemed to be one of the city rulers, says Plato, of the oligarch whose power is based on his wealth. But in reality he was neither its ruler nor its servant, but merely a consumer of its stores. Plato was here at one with his countrymen, in the 5th century, as we know from the history of the wealthy Nicias. Riches did not exclude an Athenian from the highest position in the state, but neither did they constitute a claim to political power. In his famous funeral oration, Pericles twice claims that at Athens poverty is no bar to a political career. Pericles is speaking, of course, for his own age. Money for a while became the measure of a man, and wealth by itself brought political power. We must beware of expecting simplicity anywhere in history. Even from the purely commercial point of view, there were doubtless powerful side currents that have left no trace in our extant records. The power of the Medici in Florence was based on their commercial supremacy. But it did not rest entirely on their actual trading. In part it was based on their position in the papal treasury among the Mercators Romanum Curium sequence, and in part again on the struggle between emperor and pope. Similar factors must have influenced the careers of Phaedon and other early tyrants of Greece. In part again, these early tyrants seem to have stood for a racial movement. This was certainly the case at Sicyon, where the tyranny marked the ascendancy of the pre-Dorian population. Probably also at Corinth, where the first tyrant's father belonged to the Aeolic pre-Dorian element of the population. This racial factor is easily reconciled with the commercial, quite apart from the possibility that the pre-Dorian element that comes to the top at this period may have been closely related to the Levantine race that plays so prominent a part in Aegean commerce of the present day. Nor must the personal element be left out of account, though so lamentably little is known about it. Cypselus and Phaedon, Pisistratus and Polycrates were certainly great personalities in their way. The leaders in any movement are generally that. On the whole, they seem to have ruled well. Their government, except towards opponents and rivals, was by no means oppressive. All the more surprising, therefore, is their general condemnation. It is indeed scarcely possible to explain it except on the view that they ruled by right not of their personalities but of their riches. The prosperity that they brought to their cities was altogether material. The famous works of Polycrates were altogether the works of men's hands. It is characteristic of the rule of a typical early tyrant like Periander that he encouraged the worship of Dionysus and Aphrodite at the expense of the cults of Poseidon and Apollo. No doubt his object was partly to break down the monopoly of priestly office and religious privilege that had hitherto been enjoyed by the aristocracy, but it is significant that while the tyrant's policy meant a material advance in all directions, it meant also a materialization even of religion. That is why, with a clearness of judgment that can be matched outside Greece only in Dante, the united verdict of all the Greeks utterly condemned them. 2 centuries after the expulsion of the tyrants from Athens, the city again fell under a ruler who is said to have made its material welfare his chief care, and to have prided himself that there was much profitable trade in the city, and that all enjoyed in abundance the necessaries of life. Such, according to Demochares, a nephew of Demosthenes, was the boast of Demetrius of Phalaris, and for it he is utterly condemned by Demochares as taking pride in things that might be a source of pride to a tax collector or an artisan. The condemnation is quoted by Polybius as no common charge. Polybius plainly regards it as particularly damning, for he quotes it propos of certain monstrous charges that were current about Demochares to prove that Demetrius must have refrained from supporting them for lack of evidence and not from lack of ill will. Demochares and Polybius are a long step from the early tyrants, but both in a sense belong to the period that followed the tyrant's fall. Their views about Demetrius and his materialistic policy may well be an inheritance from an earlier age. The age of the tyrants lasted for little more than 5 generations, and never so long as that in any one city. This fact may have some consolation for those who fear a modern tyranny of wealth, and offers perhaps an analogy for the observations of H. G. Wells on the transitory character of the modern financial boss. The determination not to be permanently governed by mere wealth is as strong today as it was 25 centuries ago. The loathing of capital with which our laboring classes today are growing more and more infected is explained by William James as largely composed of this sound sentiment of antipathy for lives based on mere having. He contrasts the military and aristocratic ideal of the well-born man without possessions. It is, of course, particularly hard to test the scorn of possessions of a class that can always help itself to them at a crisis. And, as William James himself admits, the ideal has always been hideously corrupted. Certainly, at the present day, the antipathies between aristocracy and militarism and capitalism are, to say the least of it, not particularly marked. It is the democracy that loathes capitalism. This may be merely a phase. The anti-capitalist movement may end by labor becoming fatally materialized or fatally impoverished. And in any country where that happens, the way will be open for a new Pisistratus.